Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hey, my dear friends. Tonight we move through soft lamp glow and drifting mist. The sort that turns every footfall into a whisper and every entrance into a little drama. You inhale smoke, stone and wet brick, while gaslights tremble like stars in puddles. A shiny cab clatters past, its driver wrapped in a cloak, and you lift your collar because this is Victorian England, where manners shine like brass and longing walks on quiet souls. You likely won't get through this if you try to stay serious the whole time. So before you settle in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, only if you truly appreciate what I create here. Tell me your town and the hour where you are, so I can see the light on your clock and hear your street's evening song. Now lower the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that gentle background drone, and let's drift into tonight's voyage together. You wander at a lazy tempo, the sound of stones underfoot, the fog covering your shoulders like a borrowed coat. Decency smiles from every shiny window. Curtains shift then freeze behind glass. Cups chime and hands rest on holy books, yet there is a pulse beneath the quiet that craves what the world claims it should not. The Victorian decades from 1837 to 1901 are known for stiff chairs and even stiffer values. Yet human nature doesn't care about furniture. You glide along, hearing for the telltale groan of a floorboard, the muffled giggle after a latch clicks, the small betrayals that every time commits in its own way. On the walkway, manners walk beside you like a guardian. A fan opens and closes, its ribs signing in secret code. You catch a quick glance, fast as a struck match. People will claim there was a whole alphabet of fans and blooms. A wink there, a half-turn here, a camellia meaning please, and a carnation meaning not now. Historians still debate whether those intricate codes truly existed or whether later generations decorated them to make the past look sweeter than it was. You don't need a dictionary to see longing when it crosses a face. It's as clear as the damp on your sleeve. You pass a church bell marking the quarter hour. The tone has a gentle parental sound, a soft hint to behave. The city, though, prefers making things up as it goes. In the alley behind a music store, a fellow in a fancy hat pauses, then moves on as if his shoes suddenly demanded attention. By daylight, he praises duty in a club where wallpapers show hunting scenes. By night, he follows a map known only to a few. The Victorian double life isn't a rumor made up for scandal. It's a way of coping. If the public stage demands seriousness, the private one will borrow comedy and drama to balance the show. Joke one arrives like a street singer. If self-control burned calories, every waistcoat here would need a warning tag. A maid slips past with a brown paper parcel, tied tightly with string, the knot as neat as her hair. Your eyes meet and you both pretend the fog is fascinating. She's leaving work late or running an errand for someone who can afford hidden tasks. The city runs on these quiet jobs. Buttons swapped, notes delivered, letters steamed and resealed. A proper household might boast a long case clock and a piano. Yet it also depends on quick people who know when to look away and when to notice everything. Everyone plays a part, and the script reads like a moral drama with extra comments. At the corner you find a shop window filled with fans, gloves and plain shawls. The ledger inside is a more suggestive novel than any printed book nearby. Which glove sizes come in pairs, which are singles, which belts are returned with long notes about fit. Quirky tidbits sneaks in under the frame. Some stylish women carry small vials of smelling salts for a feint, and some not-so-faint ladies use those same salts as a sharp excuse to leave conversations duller than boiled beef. The salts snap the air and out they glide, name intact. You tuck that trick into your pocket just for learning. You reach a square where gas lamps draw rings on the leaves. Couples drift at a proper distance, the space between them watched over by guardians and social sums. The math is endless. Who has money? Who has family? Who has a hint of shame that might be smoothed away with time and careful parties? Marriage is spoken of as holy. Yet it also works as a deal in which property and children and ties change hands with gentle ritual. The mainstream fact drops like a carriage wheel on a curb. Under English law for much of this time, a married woman's legal self is largely taken into her husband's through coverture, a word that sounds like a blanket and works like one. Heavy and cozy if you like it, heavy and suffocating if you do not. You catch the soft beat of a piano through lace drapes, a waltz shortened for a modest beat. In that room, a mother arranges seats like a chess expert. A daughter sits under a portrait of a stern relative who seems to be judging the dessert. Talk flows along safe lines. Weather, art, trips, charity fairs. Then someone mentions a book that might not be for every ear, and the room holds its air. You exhale for them quietly. Joke too wiggles its brows. This is small talk as an extreme sport with sudden drops and secret hurdles. Down a side road, a poster sticks to a fence. It announces a gathering about virtue, a group promising cleaner roads and higher ideals. As if vice were a kind of dust that a firm hand could brush from coats, moral groups collect donations and names with a passion that would impress a modern startup. They host talks where the adjectives are ironed and the metaphors are washed. Yet in the same area, behind closed blinds, the newest French novels move among readers who blush and keep flipping pages. The strain isn't a puzzle, it's a duet. One voice sings duty, the other sings hunger, and the harmony is jarring in a way the human ear oddly likes. You pause under a lamppost, letting its warm circle of light touch your face. The city has a way of teaching you to hear what's not said. A gentleman's cane taps a private rhythm. A lady's boot heel counts a faster beat when a cousin isn't looking. You hear the scrape of a key in a side door, the determined silence of someone who means to keep a promise that can't be written down. Gossip will do its work. It always does. Yet gossip is also shy. It likes corners. It dislikes daylight. If gossip had a card, it would simply read, "I was never here." Every age thinks it invented pretending. Yet the Victorians simply gave it better clothes. Public virtue walks with calm grace, while private curiosity peeks from behind the curtain. The theatre mirrors the feeling. Melodramas boom about the cost of sin. Then curtain calls cheer for actresses whose eyes suggest they know a livelier script. The press prints moral lessons in one column and cheeky stories in another, then blames the typesetter when complaints arrive. Joke 3 tips its hat. If you can keep a serious face while holding that balance, please handle my next tax papers. As you turn toward the river, the mist thins to a pearly glaze. Water slaps against wooden posts, and a faint coal smell lingers like the ghost of a fire that won't leave the room. The city is built on contradictions and clever shortcuts. People make rules to feel safe and then design gaps to feel alive. A sliding scale of mischief is handled with silk gloves and polite coughs. You walk through it all, distant and curious, the way a scientist might wander through a greenhouse, noting orchids that pretend they are lilies because lilies get tea invitations. There is no final answer tonight. The world hums with in-betweens. Physical life in these streets is bold and hidden, loud and quiet, punished and rewarded, often by the same mouths within a single afternoon. You aren't here to judge. You're here to observe. Your breath steams in the lamplight. Somewhere a clock hits the hour. The city pulls its shawl tight, pretends it didn't just wink, and practices its Sunday face in the mirror. You step onto a boulevard that pretends to be proper and discover the phrase people whisper most when night grows busy. They call it the great social evil with capital letters so heavy you can feel them land on the pavement. You watch the lights grow along Haymarket and Regent Street. See cab wheels shine like coins. Hear a quick burst of laughter from a doorway where champagne is always a bit too sweet and always a bit too warm. The word evil does a lot of lifting here. It blames, it warns, it sells papers, and it helps people believe the problem is a monster that sleeps somewhere else. Yet the figures who drift past you aren't monsters. They are workers in silk, workers in second-hand satin, workers in patched boots who know the price of coal and bread to the halfpenny. A girl with violets on her hat watches the street the way a sailor reads tides. She times her smile to the beat of boots. Some carry opera programs, some carry guilt. All carry coins. The mainstream fact is simple and unromantic. Victorian writers, including William Acton, write about sex work as a widespread urban trade and estimate many thousands of women in London alone, serving clients in streets, boarding houses, music halls, and private flats. Statistics vary with the speaker and the goal, and historians still argue whether the printed numbers are blown up by moral alarm or softened by the wish to make reform look doable. You are free to notice that numbers like to dress up for public debate. You drift beside a line of townhouses. Their names are grand, their stair carpets are forgiving, and their owners know which judges like which brand of claret. A doorman nods as if welcoming you to a church that meets after midnight. He can recite the going rates in a tone as calm as a beadle, rooms by the hour, champagne by the bottle, privacy by the smile. In another area, smaller lodgings sell time by the quarter hour, with a tired practicality that makes the candles look honest. Between the extremes sprawl sleeping houses where couples rent a corner space hidden by a sheet, privacy measured in cloth and footsteps. Joke 1 twirls past in borrowed lace. You don't need a pocket watch to understand that time is money when the bed rents by the minute. You pause at a corner where flower girls hold baskets like shields. Some sell blooms to couples on their way to dinner. Others sell introductions plus whatever the night decides. One girl sells oranges because orange peels excuse a quick stop in the alley for sticky fingers and talk. quirky tidbit drops from the basket along with a crumpled ribbon. On a few streets, certain women rent the same bright shawls from tallymen who specialize in hire clothes, returning them before dawn so the same fabric can walk again tomorrow. Costumes are capital. Silk is signage in a world that polices words. A newspaper poster shouts about rescue homes, moral groups, and fallen women who have risen again in sewing rooms. You step closer and read the promises. Beds, prayers, starch, redemption. The language is warm. The rules are strict. Some homes insist on early rising, rough laundry, and silence about the past. The managers speak of purity like managers always speak about output. You lean back and listen to the stories that don't make posters. Domestic service that paid in tiredness and firing. Factory floors where piecework nibbled at wages. A lover who promised a ring and gave an empty address. Hunger doesn't care about sermons. The path into this trade is a braid of luck, need, and the bruise left by the economy. A small carriage halts at the curb. A gentleman helps a veiled woman down with the care of an actor who knows he's being watched. They move with smooth choreography into a private door that doesn't seem to exist until they reach it. Respectable men like privacy, then like to read editorials about the danger of vice, then like to vote for someone who promises to clean the streets. The city obliges by pushing the trade from one block to the next as if moving a chair changes the song. Joke 2 tips its cap. If relocating problems counted as solving them, half the city would work as furniture movers. Police boots sound on the stones. The constable doesn't rush. He knows the routine. A warning when the crowd gets showy. A nod to an owner who keeps the stairs quiet. An arrest when the papers start counting sins and demanding a show of effort. You watch the power of secrecy at work. That power can keep a woman out of the cells tonight and make her life harder tomorrow. It is the power to sort bother from scandal, and it's fickle. Men make laws in daylight and apply them by lantern, and the shadows turn every rule into a riddle. The streets run on knowledge. Who pays? Who cheats? Who talks? Some clients prefer actresses who moonlight. Some prefer widows who need money for children. Some carry a map of the city's borders in their heads and insist on crossings that make sense only to them. You learn a fringe practice that hides in plain sight. Certain music hall dressing rooms rent out photographs for clients who want to believe they have a souvenir of closeness. The image is careful, the price is dear, and the dealer keeps a small notebook under the powder box. Nothing is wasted. Even suggestion has value here. You pass a bridge where the river hushes every conversation. Couples peel away into shadow. Behind you, a pamphleteer declares that paid sex is a disease that will eat the nation. He quotes verses and numbers with equal speed. He sells his pamphlets at a reduced rate for bulk orders, which feels like an interesting business plan. You read the small print and catch the belief that underlies it. Men are weak, women must save them. If rescue can't be done, punishment will do. The logic isn't subtle. It expects thanks and obedience from the same mouth. A cab rolls by with blinds drawn. You glimpse a hand against satin. You hear the faint clink of coins. The deal is clear and plain. What isn't clear is morality's constant costume switch. Some call the trade a sin. Some call it a safety valve. Some call it a crime against family. Some call it the only way a woman can set her own price in a market that undervalues her labor everywhere else. Historians still argue whether public campaigns against vice are chiefly about sickness and order or chiefly about worry over women moving without supervision in the new urban maze. You keep walking because the street keeps changing and every doorway edits the story one more time. A matron with a ledger sits near a stairwell, calm as a banker. She knows who can pay for a private room and who needs to share. She knows which sailors come with kind hands and which gentlemen leave complaints instead of tips. She knows the price of silence and the cost of gossip. She also knows how to throw a client down the steps when he decides that money includes the right to be cruel. Joke 3 buttons its glove. If courage drew a wage, her purse would rattle like a tambourine. You arrive at a square where lamps turn the air to honey. Couples stroll with delicate distance between their sleeves. A coach waits with a patient horse. Far off, a church bell marks the hour. The label Great Social Evil floats above the scene like a banner someone forgot to take down after a parade. It names a fear and erases a world. The world you see is detailed, contradictory, and made of people who count coins by touch. Some look for escape. Some find company that is kinder than marriage. Some get sick and vanish from the ledger. Some age into managers and make rules they wish someone had made for them when they first stepped out in a borrowed shawl. You listen to the city breathe. It does not judge. It keeps time. You follow the river toward dockyards and drill fields, and the streets begin to speak in uniforms. Here the law trains its gaze on women's bodies with the calm certainty of a man measuring a fence. The phrase that owns these blocks is Contagious Diseases Acts, a title that sounds like housekeeping and behaves like a net. Patrols name certain towns as special zones, garrison towns and naval ports, where the state decides cleanliness is strategy. If soldiers are to be healthy, the logic runs, their companions must be managed like supplies. What management means is simple. If police suspect a woman of selling sex, they can require her to submit to intimate medical inspection, and if found infected, they can require her to undergo treatment. Send her to a lock hospital for weeks of forced treatment. Mainstream fact raises its hand politely. Parliament passes these measures in the 1860s. Then withdrawal begins in the 1880s, with formal repeal arriving in 1886. Bureaucracy hates to admit it has changed its mind, but signatures on documents eventually catch up to voices in the street. You turn a corner and find the hospital gates. Iron bars, neat hedges, a notice that reads like a sermon trimmed by scissors. Inside, corridors smell of carbolic and starch. Women wait on benches, shoes paired like shy animals. Some present calmly and ask practical questions about food, work, and when they can go home. Others stare at the floor and refuse to speak at all. A matron whispers to an orderly, and a bell rings with brisk authority. You know what happens behind the partition. Speculums line a tray. A doctor records findings in crisp script as if ink can impose order on pain. Joke one walks in on tiptoe. If paperwork cured disease, half the wards would be empty by noon. A constable arrives with a small book. He will need a signature on a form consenting to examination. Consent is elastic here. Signing may be a condition of avoiding court. Refusing may bring a summons. The line between volunteer and captive blurs until even the light looks undecided. Some women sign because 3 weeks indoors beats sleeping in a doorway. Some sign because they believe the treatment might help. Some sign because the choice is not real and they have learned to follow the path that hurts less today. The power feels ordinary, and that is the unsettling part. No shouting, no drama, just ink and routine. You are told the rules with a reassuring smile. To be clean is to be lawful. To be unclean is to be detained until declared fit to return to the street, which is a definition of help that takes a long time to stop sounding like punishment. Historians still argue whether the acts are chiefly a public health policy built on the science of the day or chiefly a moral project that uses infection as a pretext to govern women and soothe official nerves. The debates push through journals and pamphlets like vines looking for sunlight. Everyone says disease is the enemy. Not everyone agrees which human being counts as the battlefield. On the ward, treatments rest in bottles and jars with labels that could be recipes or alchemical riddles. Mercury ointments wink from their tins. Syringes wait with prim patience. The regimen is strict, the tone managerial, the results inconsistent. A quirky tidbit peeks from a cupboard. Among patients, a nickname sometimes travels for the dreaded instrument, an almost playful term that turns cold metal into something you can swear at like an annoying roommate. Language becomes padding when the furniture is unforgiving. Outside the hospital, the fight gathers. A woman with clear eyes and a voice like a bell speaks to a crowded hall. She argues that the state has chosen the softest target and called it strategy. She says no government has the right to compel intimate examinations of citizens who have not been convicted of a crime. She says justice without tenderness is simply a performance. Her name is repeated with relief and suspicion and scribbled on handbills passed from glove to glove. Petitions accumulate like snowdrifts, each page heavy with the insistence that liberty belongs to everyone or it belongs to no one. The campaign insists on two truths at once. Disease is real, and so is dignity. A magistrate peers over his spectacles in a room that echoes. Cases shuffle forward. The charge is not infection. The charge is the category itself. Common prostitute is a legal label that turns rumor into paperwork. Once the category sticks, policing becomes tidier. Arrest leads to examination. Examination leads to hospital. Hospital leads to a certificate that may free a woman for the moment and bind her to surveillance. After joke, too, raises an eyebrow. If labeling were medicine, chemists would keep printers next to the tonics. You stop near the docks where sailors haul rope and gossip crosses like gulls. Policies made in Westminster reach these stones wearing boots. Men talk in the blunt verbs of ships. Women talk in caretaking details. Who needs broth? Who needs money for a sick child? Who is inside and for how long? The town learns to live with missing persons. A roommate vanishes for a fortnight and returns quieter. A friend fails to return at all. The hospital does not send postcards, and the police do not deliver explanations with tea. In a reading room, you examine a stack of pamphlets that argue with each other so politely they sound like cousins at a tense dinner. One declares the acts essential because military efficiency requires clean troops. Another calls the measures a national disgrace. The clashing texts agree on only one point. The city is a machine that runs on bodies and the machine must be tended. What counts as maintenance divides the room like a chalk line. One side trusts scalpels and orders. The other trusts consent and sunlight. You notice an odd economy forming at the edges of enforcement. Some landlords refuse to rent to women because surveillance makes tenancy complicated. Others charge more to cover the trouble of sudden inspections. Some traders specialize in quiet deliveries to hospital gates. Even charity reorganizes itself. Sewing circles send parcels of plain nightgowns that keep patients warm and anonymous. A pot of flowers appears on a sill, and nobody admits who brought it. Comfort is contraband only when pity is the only authority allowed to enter uninvited. In a quiet lane, a woman tears up her notice to attend examination and watches the bits skitter along the curb. She is tired of being the proclamation nailed to the wall. She is tired of hearing that health demands humiliation. She is tired of being a model for how laws are supposed to look when they behave. The campaign outside gives her a language for refusal. She learns phrases like constitutional liberty and equality before the law and carries them like charms. When meetings end, she walks home with pamphlets in her pocket and a plan to speak to 3 friends who are braver than they admit. By twilight, the ward windows glow like aquariums. Inside, a nurse smooths a sheet with the brisk kindness of someone who knows how to make suffering smaller without promising to erase it. A doctor notes a discharge, and the gate admits a woman who breathes in air as if the city was soup. The policy continues in some towns and sputters in others, while politicians count petitions and count their prospects. Joke 3 touches its hat. If votes were thermometers, you could take the temperature of a policy by pressing an election to its forehead. The night wraps the buildings in quiet. The river keeps its own counsel. The iron gate is closed for the evening and the last visitor hurries away. You listen for a verdict and hear only the tick of official clocks. Policies change like tides that do not announce themselves. What remains is the memory of hands that held a form, steady voices that filled a hall with the same sentence until it sounded like a bell, and the stubborn certainty that bodies are not government property, even when the government convinces itself that strategy wears a white coat. You enter a drawing room where the rugs hush every step and social rules hum louder than the piano. A parlor seems soft, but it has edges. Chairs sit at angles that prevent knees from brushing. A screen protects a fire that is already tame. On the console, calling cards bloom like a paper garden, each with a name engraved in a script so elegant it looks slightly exhausted. You stand by the mantel the way etiquette books suggest. Not too close, not too far, hands relaxed, expression calm, as if you were born knowing the difference between a visit and a visit. A maid presents a silver tray and you surrender your card as if delivering a passport. The ritual is precise. If the lady of the house is at home today, you are admitted after a polite wait long enough to suggest she was not sitting behind the curtain waiting for you. If she is not at home, you leave your corners intact and retreat with dignity, which is good practice for many conversations in life. Mainstream fact steps forward in a sensible dress. In this country during the mid and late 19th century, calling hours structure courtship and friendship, and a young woman of the middle or upper classes rarely receives an unrelated man without a chaperone present. The chaperone is not mere decoration. She is the guardian of narrative, ensuring that every sentence in the evening reads correctly. You take a seat on a settee upholstered in polite florals. It sits low, ready for languid poses and strategic swoons. The fainting couch nearby suggests fragility but also offers a stage. Historians still argue whether fainting owes more to tight stays, warm rooms, and the thrill of flirtation or to anemia, polluted air, and the heavy expectation of being delightful for hours without honest conversation. Either way, smelling salts glint in a tiny bottle on the side table, a domestic safety net with a lemony snap. Joke 1 waves its fan. If small talk were cardio, the entire neighborhood would have astonishing lung capacity by spring. A mother enters with weather in her smile. She arranges the seating the way a conductor arranges a string quartet. Her daughter sits across from you with a work basket that contains almost no work at all. She lifts a needle, lowers it, and makes eye contact with the precision of a metronome. You compliment the rose at her throat because jewelry that imitates living things is fashionable and safer to praise than actual opinions. Her answer is cordial and slightly amused, the tone of someone who expects compliments the way roses expect dew. Conversation slides along topics approved by a long committee of invisible aunts. Music, charitable bazaars, travel that was educational rather than scandalous, books that everyone agrees are improving. A footman brings tea in cups that tremble just enough to prove they are fine. The saucers saucer politely. You count the sugar cubes for tempo and speak in sentences that never run downhill. A discreet cough from the chaperone keeps the air tidy. Everyone pretends not to see the dance card tucked under the daughter's ribbon. Tonight there might be a musical, and the card will fill with pencil initials and hope. A quirky tidbit peeks from a drawer beside the harp. In February the post office groans under mountains of valentines, and among the lace and cherubs there circulate vinegar valentines that deliver witty insults instead of affection. Some households laugh and pin them on the mantel, others ban the postman for a week. The economic ledger of romance hides in the curtains. Marriages collect property as quietly as dust. Families speak of love and mean it, then speak to solicitors and mean that too. You hear the rustle of documents that will specify jointures, pin money and expectations about settlements. The arithmetic is not cynical, it is structural. A dowry might ease a mortgage. An alliance might settle an argument between anxious uncles. The 1857 Matrimonial Causes Act now allows civil divorce through a special court, a mainstream change that places marriage under a different kind of scrutiny. Although the standard for dissolving it still favors male petitioners, everyone knows the headline and pretends not to. The parlor keeps the tone light. A cousin arrives to chaperone a walk. The route is public and the pace unhurried. You stroll through a park designed for this very act of display. Hats speak before mouths do. Gloves act like speech bubbles. You admire the statue everyone admires, then deliver a line about landscape that suggests both taste and thrift. The cousin pretends to notice swans at crucial moments. If she receives a bouquet later, she will count the stems for meaning. If you bring a book, the inscription will be brief and beautiful and completely admissible. At a ball, the rules glitter. Dance positions allow palms to meet in a choreography that manages to be both intimate and not actionable. Your name appears on a card beside a waltz and a quadrille, which is practically a resume. Between sets, you retreat to a fern-filled conservatory where air smells like a greenhouse trying to be a forest. Joke, too, taps the glass. If flirtation required a license, half the orchestra would moonlight as examiners. A gentleman envies the freedom of a rose but lives by a timetable. His route includes club, office and parlor, with subtle detours into flower stores and jewelers whose salesmen know how to keep a secret. He negotiates expectations from parents who scan dowries and note the fortunes behind certain surnames. He learns to fold affection into admissible gestures. A new waltz learned quickly. A charity subscription increased modestly. A drive in the park at the correct hour so the right people will see and say the right things. Reputation is a currency printed on both sides. The woman at the center of this minute theater reads all of it. She starts as the observed and becomes the strategist. That settee supports a general. She preserves mystery because mystery protects negotiation. She avoids solo promenades because signatures matter more than sincerity. She knows which suitors wish to marry a wife and which wish to marry a family. She also knows which wish to marry an idea and will grow restless when real life insists on grocery lists and illnesses and the cheerful noise of future toddlers. The engagement moment is a ceremony engineered to look spontaneous. A ring appears with a diamond that catches lamplight like a promise. Hair jewelry may follow, a locket with a coil arranged as carefully as a miniature waterfall. The tokens carry emotion that is both personal and exchangeable. They move through households like ambassadors, cementing alliances with sparkle. The event requires letters, calls, and a tiered cake of reactions. Some relatives cheer, some calculate. A few disappear into the garden to nurse an opinion until it becomes palatable. Parlor games supply a softer stage for the negotiations that cannot be printed. Forfeits encourage mock trials and playful penalties that allow quick touches under a duvet of laughter. Squeak, piggy squeak accomplishes the same with a ridiculousness that gives cover. The games are not subversive so much as practical. They allow courtship to practice being a friendship which will matter when the flowers fade and the piano needs tuning again. Everyone pretends they are here for amusement. Everyone knows they are here for assessment. Etiquette manuals sit on side tables like benevolent spies. Mrs. Beaton offers menus and advice that turn hospitality into an exact science. Other writers compose small sermons about feminine influence, domestic harmony, and the proper balance of compliance and conviction. These guides do not guarantee happiness, but they do supply scripts. A script is a comfort when a room is full and expectations stand around like footmen. Joke 3 checks the mantel clock. If wisdom came leather-bound with gilt edges, every bookshelf would glow like a chandelier. The evening dissolves into good nights that last almost as long as the party. You bow or curtsy with the right depth. You retrieve your card and notice how many initials match your hopes. The host smiles like a man who believes balance has been achieved, and perhaps it has. The door closes with a soft plunge of air. Outside, cabs count seconds in hoofbeats and the city exhales. Somewhere a cousin tallies bouquets. Somewhere a mother edits a guest list with surgical precision. Somewhere a young couple looks at a ring in the lamplight and learns how easily yes can echo in a quiet room. You step into a school corridor that smells of ink, chalk and starch and find a notice board where the most urgent rule is about hands. The phrase self-abuse floats like a ghost in the dormitory air. A warning whispered by tutors, pamphlets and worried parents. You stand by the iron beds as a prefect pads past with a lantern, checking sheets for suspicious warmth and reminding boys to sleep with hands visible on the coverlet. A bell somewhere argues with the dark. The hour is late, the imagination is busy, and the culture has decided that a private habit can unstring minds, drain vigor, and cancel futures with a single unwise minute. A cabinet in the infirmary carries bottles marked with respectable labels, but the real medicine is terror. Tracts line a shelf in honest brown bindings. They promise medical law and moral rescue, and they describe a chain of symptoms so comprehensive it might as well include untidiness and poor Latin. The mainstream fact walks out in a black coat. 19th century physicians across Britain routinely pathologize masturbation under the name spermatoria or self-abuse, blaming it for nervous collapse and even insanity. And asylum case books record patients with the supposed diagnosis of masturbatory mania. A doctor sits behind a tidy desk and writes that a youth who indulges will wither into pallor and melancholy, then confirms his expertise by adding dietary advice about plain food and cold baths. Joke one adjusts its spectacles. If cold water solved every moral panic, the temperance movement would have counted as a university. A matron shows you the dormitory ritual. Sheets stretched tight, nightshirts buttoned to the chin, inspection before lights out. If a boy looks flushed, he is sent to the sick room for cooling compresses and a lecture that could outlast a winter storm. A tutor reads from a pamphlet that insists the soul lives in the bloodstream and can be squandered in careless episodes. Historians still argue whether educators truly believed every catastrophic claim, or whether the warning served as a convenient tool for obedience in crowded institutions where supervision was thin and fear was cheap. The debate matters less to the child who memorizes the speech by heart and sleeps like a soldier on watch. You move along a counter where clever devices gleam with the neutrality of brass. An instrument maker from a respectable address in London offers discreet safeguards. One contraption is a ring lined with little teeth that promises to discourage nocturnal impulse by transforming it into a lesson. Another strap around the waist and fastens to the bed frame so that wandering hands ring a tiny bell for the monitor on duty. A quirky tidbit lifts the bell pull with a shy smile. Some of these anti-masturbation alarms are advertised alongside trusses and pessaries in medical catalogues, proof that shame can be marketed with exactly the same typography as hernia support. Commerce admires a steady customer more than a sound hypothesis. The school day adds reinforcements. Physical drills, brisk walks, and cold ablutions arrive under the banner of character. Breakfast rejects spices as if cinnamon were a revolutionary. Porridge appears as a moral tutor in a bowl. Tutors praise cricket for channeling vigor into noble team spirit, which is handy since cricket also keeps boys outside and tired. A grim sentence in the handbook praises hard mattresses for discouraging what soft mattresses apparently encourage. You catch a whisper that beds will be separated by a proper span, just in case proximity is a gateway to catastrophe. Joke 2 sidesteps a basin. If morality depended on thread count, the linen cupboard would be a theological seminary. The panic is not limited to schools. In middle-class parlors, parents read articles that make the blood run colder than the bath. A mother confides to a friend that her child's appetite seems diminished, then admits she has been measuring pallor as if it were a legal document. A father recommends fencing lessons because lunges are the next best thing to prayer. In a surgery, a physician recommends a regimen of tonics and outdoor labor, speaking gravely of the reproductive system as if it were a country estate that must never be overworked. He sells a bottle of something with iron in it, then prescribes wholesome company at a very early bedtime. In a bookshop, you find medical guides that perform a strange dance. They denounce explicitness and then offer explicit anatomy plates. They insist that words must be delicate and then borrow a vocabulary from classical languages like a curtain that lets everything through. They repeat a storyline in which self-control guarantees health and weakness invites doom. The plot has villains and heroes, and something like a chorus in the back pages where testimonials speak in confident tones of rescued boys who now study diligently and never think about anything in the dark ever again. The girl's wing is quieter and yet pressed by its own anxieties. A governess corrects posture, diet, and bedtime. She mentions modesty and purity with a light touch that has steel in it. Doctors publish theories about female desire that can be summarized as inconsistent. One authority declares that respectable women feel little sexual impulse at all, a claim made with a certainty that suggests more observation of drawing rooms than marriages. Another writes that hidden storms can ravage nerves and therefore must be prevented by careful management of boarding schools and reading lists. The rules look like gentleness. The effect feels like surveillance. You pass a shelf of gadgets that promise to restore vigor to nervous constitutions without ever naming the central anxiety. Pulley systems, vibrating chairs, and galvanic belts all propose that the body can be tuned like a clock if only the right current is applied. The advertising voice is soothing and practical, a cousin of the tone used to sell improved sewing machines and stoves. The technology sounds modern. The fear is not. It is an old story wearing a new battery. Night returns and with it the checks. A monitor holds a candle under his chin like a lantern saint and counts breathing rhythms. You listen as guilt and curiosity argue in the beds, two old debaters who never run out of quips. Someone mutters about the rumor that soap in the bathwater can blunt temptation. A folklore chemistry lesson that refuses to graduate. Someone else swears that a diet of boiled vegetables rewires the moral compass, which might be the earliest case of kale being asked to perform miracles. Joke 3 counts the footsteps. If carrots built character, rabbits would give sermons. The medical office locks its cabinet and leaves a notice about the dangers of solitary vice pinned with an accuracy that suggests the pin has done this job before. The building exudes order and the children absorb it like air. Some will carry the panic into adulthood and fold it carefully into marriage. Some will discard it like a tight collar on the first day in their own flats. A few will keep the gadgets, the admonitions and the diet and insist they feel better for it, which is either a victory for placebo, a victory for routine, or a victory for finally being listened to when anxious nights needed a name. Outside, the corridor fades into stillness. The rule books do not snore, the bell sleeps. Bodies, which know their own clocks, do what bodies have always done. Morning will bring calisthenics, lectures and porridge, and the notice board will continue to shout in a dignified font. The culture will keep selling cures that promise safety without saying aloud what danger is. Somewhere a printer sharpens new type for next year's edition. Somewhere a child learns to breathe slowly in the dark until fear quiets enough to let sleep back in. You enter a consulting room where the clock's tick tries to sound scientific and the curtains try to look modest. The doctor's chair sits higher than yours by exactly the thickness of authority. On the desk, glass bottles nest in a tray, each labeled in a hand that believes neatness equals cure. The word that circles this room is hysteria. A diagnosis that promises to explain nervous tremors, sleeplessness, fits of tears, irritability, fatigue, and a long parade of other complaints that change shape as easily as steam. The mainstream fact stands up and adjusts its cuffs. Mid-19th century British medicine uses hysteria as a catch-all for women's distress. And some practitioners prescribe rest cures, hydrotherapy, uterine tonics, bromides, or even surgical interventions. The list is long enough to feel like a menu. The prices are measured in dignity as often as in shillings. The examination begins with questions that tilt politely toward confession. How is your appetite? How are your nerves? How often do you feel a weight in the lower abdomen? The physician watches posture the way a dance master watches feet, looking for signs that the womb has shifted like furniture. He may prescribe bed rest in a quiet room with curtains drawn and visitors limited to the least exciting relatives, which is a sentence that can feel like a winter with no windows. He may recommend a daily soak in a sitz bath cooled by blocks of river ice. Joke 1 taps the thermometer. If cold water could solve every mystery of the human heart, the bath would be a philosopher. A shelf holds instruments that gleam with the hush of metal that wants to be trusted. There are pessaries shaped like donuts and pears, little devices meant to prop a uterus that has been accused of wandering. There are syringes for douches labeled as hygienic and medicinal that carry recipes of alum, vinegar, and other solutions that sound like a pantry auditioning for the role of pharmacy. Quirky tidbit peers from a velvet case. Certain fashionable spas rent electrotherapy chairs that promise vibratory relief for nervous conditions, and their advertising advertisements sit beside adverts for patent corsets and hair tonic, the tone equally soothing in each column. Electricity, it seems, is the Bouillon cube of modern hopes. The language of hysteria prefers the passive voice. Symptoms are observed, treatments are administered, patients are improved. You notice the verbs duck responsibility like schoolboys ducking a cricket ball. Meanwhile, the pulse of the work shows in smaller acts. A nurse warms stones in the hearth to lay on a belly that will not unclench. A chemist compounds tinctures of opium with a seriousness that can put a night to sleep for a price that often includes tomorrow's foggy head. A doctor employs pelvic massage as a therapy for congestion that is described with an awkwardness that would be funny if the room did not smell of anxiety and lavender water. Historians still argue whether the familiar story about physicians regularly using manual stimulation to provoke therapeutic paroxysms is a myth inflated by later writers or a practice that was common enough to be an open secret. The debate sits on the edge of the desk like a paperweight noticeable every time the door is shut. Not every remedy is gentle. A London surgeon named Isaac Baker Brown performs clitoridectomies in the 1860s as a supposed cure for seizures, melancholia, and what he terms unnatural habits. The profession eventually expels him in 1867 for operating without sufficient consent and evidence, a mainstream moment when medical authority admits that enthusiasm is not the same as proof. The severity of his knife throws the rest of the tool cabinet into a new light. There is a spectrum in this room, and kindness does not always stand at the correct end of it. The rest cure has its own choreography. A woman is placed in a quiet chamber. She is forbidden to read, to write, to climb stairs more than a prescribed number, to talk about worries that smack of thinking too hard. A nurse brings milk, broth, and sweet biscuits, then measures calm as if it were a pulse. The logic suggests that overstimulation is the enemy, and that stillness will rebuild the nervous system grain by grain. Sometimes it eases exhaustion. Sometimes it drives a person to invent reasons to leave the bed. Joke, too, raises the blind a half-inch. If idleness were medicine, the laziest cat in the neighborhood would be a licensed practitioner. Hydropathy clinics polish their tiles and promise equilibrium through disciplined soaking. You sit in a wooden tub and watch your breath come out in tidy clouds. Outside the bathing rooms, a pamphlet claims that jets of water can rebuke insomnia, scold uterine irritability, and remind despair to behave. The tone is confident without becoming vulgar. The schedule is posted like a railway timetable. 8 a.m. tonic douche, 2 p.m. compresses and a walk at a pace that is interesting but not alarming. Evening, quiet reading if the physician approves the book. The machinery hums like a friendly factory, and for a few days the order may feel like a promise. Electrical therapy adds a faint scent of ozone to the atmosphere of hope. Coils thrum, handles buzz. The practitioner explains with impressive patience that a nervous system is an electrical system and that a gentle current can persuade it to remember its duty. The patient nods because the logic sounds modern, and modern is sometimes as good as true. If the session ends with a calmer mood, the wires get credit. If it does not, the dose was insufficient or the patient insufficiently obedient to the schedule. The machine never apologizes. It never has to. Its voice is the same every day. In a different consulting room, a physician prescribes marriage as the most comprehensive tonic, a sentence that compresses economics, respectability, and desire into one tidy prescription. The patient smiles or does not. The doctor does not always notice the difference. Another patient receives a recommendation for horseback riding to shake loose a stubborn malaise. A plan that turns the body into a metronome and occasionally succeeds at shaking loose something else entirely. Quirky details cling to the saddle. Riding schools advertise health benefits that include better color and improved spirits. Phrases that blush on the page. Language itself becomes part of the treatment. A woman is urged to avoid novels that excite, to cultivate needlework that calms, to keep a diary that records gratitude like a tithe. Some find comfort in the ritual. Others feel as if their interior life is being asked to dress in a uniform 2 sizes too small. The room does not ask for opinions. It asks for progress. Historians still argue whether hysteria functions mainly as a label for genuine neurological and endocrine disorders that science could not yet pass, or as a cultural diagnosis aimed at disciplining women who were angry, clever, exhausted, or bored inside a narrow domestic script. The answer may be both, and the bothness is the one thing the case notes seldom admit. There are successes here. A woman with grinding insomnia finds sleep after a week of quiet and simple food. Another plagued by palpitations and dread improves when a doctor finally listens longer than 5 minutes and prescribes walks with a kindly companion rather than more laudanum. A third, crushed by grief that someone called mere nerves, feels her breathing loosen when the nurse teaches her to count it. Compassion works even when the Latin on the bottle does not. Joke 3 checks the pulse with 2 fingers. If listening were a pill, every chemist would have a queue out to the lamppost. The day ends with the doctor writing in his ledger. Symptoms rendered into tidy lines. Treatments written as if they were verdicts. Outcomes measured with a ruler that was carved by convention. The room smells of ink and lemon soap. Outside, the street forgets to be scientific and simply lives. Inside, the diagnosis holds like a paper mask that sometimes fits and sometimes tears when the patient tries to speak through it. The clock finally stops ticking and the silence feels honest for the first time all afternoon. You step off a crowded pavement into a chemist shop where glass jars glow like moons and discretion hangs heavier than the scent of carbolic. The bell gives a modest chirp. Shelves hold cough mixtures and hair oils up front. But the real trade lies behind the counter in drawers that do not open unless the conversation has learned the right rhythm. You lay down a coin for tooth powder and receive a nod that asks whether you require anything more particular this evening. The shopkeeper's face is the perfect mix of bored and helpful. A mask practiced until it feels like skin. You lower your voice. Words behave themselves. Nobody says the product name aloud. A folded paper slips across the wood as if it were just another recipe. The packet looks innocent, sealed with gummed corners, and inside waits a sheath the city names with gallant euphemisms. Some prefer French letters, some say preventatives. A few say rubbers. The mainstream fact stands in its sensible shoes. After the discovery of vulcanization in the 1840s, rubber condoms begin to appear in British shops, joining older sheepgut varieties that have already circulated for generations under more fragile names. The rubber versions are thicker, sometimes reusable, stitched along a seam, and occasionally fitted with a ribbon tie that looks too dainty for such a practical purpose. A gentleman checks the door twice while the chemist explains sizes in a tone that could be describing shoelaces. The rubber smells faintly industrial. The gut is more subtle, pale like parchment, and stored in a small tin with a paper lining. Each kind has its fans. Rubber keeps its shape and forgives haste. Gut is thinner and closer to nothing at all, though it demands a little preparation. The city swears by tricks such as warming the packet by the hearth or rubbing a drop of almond oil along the edge. Quirky tidbit peeks out of a drawer. Some instructions recommend soaking a gut sheath briefly in milk to soften them. A domestic ritual that would make breakfast an interesting conversation if anyone admitted it. The law hovers like a customer who never buys anything. Printed adverts for contraceptives attract trouble. The 1857 Obscene Publications Act gives officials a broom to sweep printed matter and some goods from public view, and enforcement arrives in spasms. Loud one month and drowsy the next. Chemists adapt. Euphemisms multiply. In the window, a sign reads, "Protective appliances for gentlemen," which could mean anything from trusses to miracles of discretion. Pamphlets about family happiness stand near piles of bath sponges, as if innocence can lend an alibi. A policeman might step in and buy throat lozenges just to remind the room that throats exist. The shopkeeper's hands stay polite. You walk to another counter where small boxes of sponges wait in respectable silence. These are not for scrubbing pans. They are cut to fit, sometimes tied with a thread so they can be retrieved later. Sometimes rinsed in solutions that promise clever chemistry. Recipes include vinegar, alum, or quinine. The theory is straightforward. A barrier, a rinse, a prayer to probability. Some women sew a thin muslin bag to sheath a sponge, creating a gentler surface and a sense of control. The shop sells plain thread for those who prefer to craft their own and keep the purchase unmentionable. Historians still argue whether sponges actually reduce pregnancy rates in the way household folklore claims, or whether the main benefit is psychological, a sense that intention has joined the act, and intention is half the victory on sleepless nights. A clerk demonstrates a syringe whose nozzle looks too prim for its job. The word hygienic whispers across the box. The postscript says consult your physician, which is useful in households where the physician believes patients deserve privacy, and less useful where physicians decide that ignorance is the best shield against appetite. You notice how the counter organizes the world into tidiness. Bottles label themselves in Latin to stay respectable. The drawers speak in code to stay employed. Behind the facade, demand is steady. Couples plan spacing as carefully as they plan furniture, and the cash box records their choices with exact change. The trade extends beyond chemists. Gentlemen's outfitters keep a drawer for travelers who do not wish to discuss health on a public high street. Barbers hear the cough and nod language that allows purchase without a sentence longer than 5 words. A quick sale slips into a pocket with gloves and tickets. Joke 1 adjusts its cuffs. If discretion were a currency, the barbers of the city would own half the banks by now. You pass into a back room where a seamstress stitches narrow bands of ribbon for the sheath that requires a tie. Her needle moves fast, practical as rent. She will never see the buyers and would not care to. What interests her is the rate per dozen and whether the agent returns on time. Workrooms like hers make the hidden parts of the city's prudence. A drawer in her table holds small lengths of kid leather for caps that press more neatly into place. An import copied from continental samples and sold to those who prefer a fixed barrier to improvisation. The market contains every shade of certainty, from cautious experiment to daily habit. In a lodging house, a landlady keeps a small stock for tenants. She calls them sensible ones. She charges a markup that pays for coal in February. She insists on quiet and on money first. She does not ask names because names once asked to be remembered, and she promised herself long ago not to collect small memories that might grow teeth. Her rule is practical. The city supplies fragile people at a rate no conscience can afford at full price. You meet a married couple who enter a chemist together, a gesture that some would consider bold, and others would consider the plain business of a household making a plan. They ask for sponges and powder and instructions on cleansing that sound like advice for porcelain. They buy a small bottle of antiseptic, not because it helps much, but because cleanliness feels like a ritual that dignifies the choice. The chemist supplies words as carefully as goods. He says protection, he says spacing. He does not say sin or sinlessness. He says timing. They nod as if the calendar itself were another instrument on the shelf. The newspapers pretend to ignore all this while reporting prosecutions with the relish of theatre critics. Stories of seized parcels appear between ads for patent heaters and restorative wines. Public virtue enjoys a good villain, and the courts sometimes oblige by treating chemists as if they were smugglers of thunder. Yet city records tell a slower tale. Demand adjusts and finds new doors. The brown paper changes supplier. The euphemisms alter their hats. Couples learn which counters accept a question asked in a voice that shakes. You slip into a lane where a signboard advertises marital aids that are absolutely not what you think they are. Inside, a salesman shows a thick rubber sheath and calls it a protector for sportsmen. The grin is so faint it might be a tremor. The price is high for most pockets, and the current fashion is to reuse. Buyers wash and powder the rubber, store it carefully, and declare themselves thrifty moderns. Gut versions cannot be treated the same way. So some customers split purchases, buying one of each, a hedging strategy worthy of a cautious investor. Joke 2 taps the till. If prudence paid interest, the ledger would hum like a hive. The room collects stories of failures too. A shopkeeper mentions tears in seams, rushed fumbling that defeats good intentions, syringes that arrive cracked from the post because the clerk wrapped them as if they were spoons. People want a guarantee and the century cannot deliver it. What it can deliver is choice shaped by price, discretion and nerves. Historians still argue whether condoms in this era are used chiefly by men visiting sex workers or whether married households adopt them widely behind curtains that never gossip. The answer changes with class, with region, and with the ability to pretend that a paper packet never needed a receipt. Night gathers outside, and the chemist douses one lamp at a time. A final customer arrives, buys a packet with a cough that means thank you, and vanishes into fog that has better manners than questions. The drawers shut, the ledger closes. The shop smells of peppermint and a faint ghost of rubber. You leave with careful steps, packet tucked beneath your glove, ears tuned to the ordinary sounds of hoofbeats and laughter. The city keeps its bargains without applause. Privacy is not virtue and not vice. It is a closed door with a key that fits, and tonight the key is small and made of paper. Joke 3 stops at the threshold and winks. If common sense could be bottled, the label would say, "Keep out of reach of Parliament and strong sunlight." You turn into a narrow lane where shop fronts lean like conspirators and brown paper carries more secrets than silk. A boy whistles twice. The signal for a parcel that needs a quiet exit. The city has discovered a new definition of crime printed in tidy type and carried in coat pockets. The Obscene Publications Act of 1857 calls itself a disinfectant for the national mind. And in practice, it gives magistrates power to seize and destroy literature that might corrupt, a mainstream fact that changes how bookstores breathe. Clerks now flatten flyleaves as if they were checking pulses. Packets travel under plain wrappers tied with honest string, and the post office acquires a nose for naughty oxygen. A constable walks past a window filled with sermons and travelogues, then stops because the binding on a certain volume has ideas above its station. He enters, removes his hat with ceremony, and asks to see the back room. The bookseller complies with a politeness learned through fines. Inside lie stacks of texts that pretend to be medical but blush at the illustrations, translations that pretend to be classical but cannot keep a straight face, and imported engravings that pretend to be art yet insist on visiting bedrooms. Seizure warrants speak in crisp sentences. A handcart waits outside like a stage prop. Joke one adjusts its gloves. If virtue always arrived with tidy paperwork, justice would need a filing clerk more than a sword. You crossed a Holywell Street, sometimes called the Street of Dirty Books, a parade of publishers and second-hand dealers who judge customers by the tilt of a hat. Catalogues circulate in ink the color of secrets. They promise lives laid bare, scenes of Paris, the conversation pieces of classical Rome, and a dictionary of expressions not fit for the breakfast table. Buyers use phrases that function like passwords. They ask for curiosities, for cabinets of Venus, for French pictures with discretion. The counters trade in what everyone pretends no one wants. As soon as the law gives the trade a costume, the trade learns to walk in it. A parcel changes hands with the speed of a magician's scarf. Brown paper is the city's favorite camouflage. Wrapping becomes an art. Corners folded like origami, string knotted with a flourish that can be undone in one tug. Some shops offer the extra service of double wrapping, so the title on the inner paper is as unremarkable as an almanac. Quirky tidbit winks from the twine. Certain regulars request a fake label on the inner packet, something like Hymns for the Young, which works until an overzealous constable opens the hymn book in court, and the choir loses its composure. At the police court, the stage is brighter. A pile of confiscated books sits on the clerk's table like a guilty snowdrift. The prosecutor quotes the law and then with visible discomfort extracts brief passages to prove his point, which brevity the audience quietly regrets. The defense replies that private morality does not belong to the magistrate's shelf and that adults may choose their reading without the sky cracking. Historians still argue whether these prosecutions mainly protect working-class readers from predatory dealers, or mainly protect middle-class sensibilities from the knowledge that appetite reads as readily as it dances. The arguments wear wigs and smile without showing teeth. A judge reaches for a principle and finds one in 1868. The Hicklin decision, named for a case involving pamphlets that upset a devout bookseller, defines obscenity by the tendency of material to deprave and corrupt those open to immoral influences, which might include children and other delicate souls. That test allows a court to look at isolated passages rather than whole works, a mainstream doctrine that arms prosecutors with scissors and magnifying glasses. Books grow nervous. Even serious texts fear being quoted for the one paragraph that misbehaves. Customs officers learn a new dance at the docks. Crates marked photographic apparatus sometimes contain more apparatus than the label admits. French lithographs arrive in portfolios with pastoral covers, cows in the meadow on the outside and very different grazing within. Printers on the continent oblige the English market by producing editions with bilingual captions for those who like their education thorough. Seizures become trophies. Officials stack the goods in storage rooms that smell like damp wood and moral enthusiasm, then light bonfires that send discreet smoke into the sky. The city reads the smoke and raises an eyebrow. Booksellers adapt with comic ingenuity. They create libraries within libraries where members in good standing may borrow travelogues with extra illustrations not shown to casual callers. Tickets are stamped with initials that mean nothing until you ask in the right way. Some dealers rent reading rooms by the hour so patrons can consume a pamphlet and depart without the risk of a search at home. Others partner with commercial photographers who produce postcards in poses carefully, arranged to be artistic when the constable visits and rather less so when the curtain falls. Joke 2 checks the mantel clock. If loopholes drew rent, the law would own half the street by Christmas. The post office becomes a character in the story. Parcels with suspect bulges are detained. Letters that smell of foreign ink are opened under warrant. Circulars offering catalogues are intercepted, then used to arrange stings. A plainclothes officer writes for a price list, sends a postal order, and waits behind a counter to catch the clerk who signs for delivery. The scene feels theatrical because it is. The courtroom prefers scripts where temptation is offered, and virtue slaps it from the counter. Juries try to perform both roles at once and occasionally forget their lines. Not every targeted book is pure titillation. Some treatises, frank about reproduction or venereal disease, are accused of corrupting because they use precise vocabulary. A surgeon who prints realistic plates can find himself defending science to an audience that believes ignorance is safer than information. The contradiction is steady. The state wants citizens to be healthy and then hides the very knowledge that would help them. A shopkeeper whispers that medical works sell well to frightened newlyweds and mothers who would rather learn from paper than from rumor. The law does not always bother to separate learning from longing, and both end up in the same sack. You hear about a warehouse raid where boxes of a certain clandestine magazine are seized minutes after arrival. The composition is crude, the jokes are worse, but the demand is real. A few volumes escape and circulate hand to hand, wrapped in newspaper that stains the fingers. Readers hide them between mattress and rope, in hat boxes, under the false bottom of a tea caddy. The hiding places are a folklore of their own. Quirky habit peaks from a mantel clock. Some people choose to store risque prints behind the backing paper of respectable framed portraits. A domestic irony that gives stern ancestors a secret second life. A moral society hosts a lecture titled "The Plague of Obscene Literature." Attendance is excellent. The speaker displays a handful of shocking examples, then has to slap a gentleman's wrist for lingering over the exhibit table. Donations pour in. Pledges are made. Pamphlets are ordered by the thousand. The campaign marches forward with banners and starch. The effect on the market is predictable. Prices rise. Collectors multiply. Scarcity breeds romance, and the very act of making a book forbidden teaches readers to feel both danger and importance while turning a page. Joke 3 bows from the rostrum. If scarcity were a sermon, every banned book would convert half the pews. Night lowers itself over the lane again. The trade continues at a softer volume. A printer inks plates behind shuttered windows. A car whistles and does not look at his cargo. A customer slips a coin across a counter and receives something that could be a map of paradise or a waste of paper, or both in the same afternoon. The law has teeth, but appetite has patience. Courts pronounce, streets negotiate. Brown paper rustles in the dark, not as a sin, not as a virtue, simply as a sound that cities make when rules and desires strike a truce for one more night. You ease into a packed courtroom where hats bloom like a dark garden, and every cough sounds like punctuation. 2 figures hold the room with a calm that looks borrowed from someplace braver. Their names circulate through whispers and newspaper ink. Charles Bradlaugh, secularist orator, a man who enjoys an argument the way a pianist enjoys a keyboard. Annie Besant, writer, organizer, a presence so steady that even the judge glances twice. The object at the center is small enough to fit a coat pocket. A thin pamphlet titled Fruits of Philosophy, written decades earlier by an American physician named Charles Knowlton, now reprinted and sold cheaply, so working families can read about preventing conception without visiting a chemist who asks too many questions. Mainstream fact steps forward with its collar straightened. In 1877, Bradlaugh and Besant stand trial in London for publishing that pamphlet and are convicted under obscenity law. Though the conviction is later quashed on technical grounds, a twist that turns a courtroom drama into a traveling debate. The clerk drones charges that pretend to be tidy. The prosecutor insists the text would corrupt the tender-minded and that it replaces restraint with calculation. He reads selected lines in a voice so delicate it might faint if a comma misbehaves. The contrast with the crowd is almost funny. You feel an electricity that belongs more to a theater than a court. The crackle that comes when forbidden words are about to become public property. Joke 1 taps the rail. If silence were a point, printing the indictment probably was not the best strategy. Besant rises to speak, and the air seems to change temperature. She argues that knowledge about reproduction is not filth, and that families who already teeter on the edge of poverty deserve honest information, not sermons. She says that women bear the heaviest cost when pregnancies arrive like weather, and that treating information as a poison is a luxury of the comfortable. She is measured, factual, stubborn. She is not asking for permission to blush. Bradlaugh follows with the rhetoric of a man who knows where every echo in the hall lives. He frames the case as a question of liberty and the right to print what citizens may reasonably discuss in their own homes. The judge listens with an expression that belongs on a statue. Outside the court, hawkers sell both sides of the argument. Moral tracts promise to protect hearth and nation. Street sellers flourish fresh copies of the very pamphlet on the charge sheet, freshly reprinted in larger numbers the instant the case made it famous. That is the city's favorite paradox. Condemnation works as advertising. Printers who could not give the thing away last month now run their presses until the rollers complain. Quirky tidbit steps out of a doorway with ink on its sleeves. Cheap editions of the trial speeches themselves become bestsellers, complete with dramatic headings and judges' comments. So, the public buys a playbill and a program in the same shilling. The jury files out and returns with the awkward speed of people who know their verdict will be quoted at breakfast. Guilty. Sentencing stirs, then hesitates, then arranges itself into a punishment that sounds decisive to some and theatrical to others. Appeals rumble forward. Lawyers argue the wording of indictments, the meaning of intention, the reach of a law that pretends it can measure blushes. On a technical point, the conviction does not hold. Papers print this like a magician revealing the trapdoor under the platform. The courtroom wins headlines. The streets win information. You step into a lecture hall where Besant stands behind a table and speaks with the authority of someone who has paid for every sentence with time and reputation. She explains anatomy without embroidery. She speaks about spacing births as a form of compassion inside marriage. She recommends that couples think about rent, bread, and the tenderness a tired body can supply. The audience is not composed of libertines. It is composed of clerks, seamstresses, carpenters, mothers with careful faces. A basket at the door collects pennies to keep the hall lit. Historians still argue whether these lectures truly shifted behavior on a large scale or whether they mainly gave language and confidence to choices that households were already making in private. The certainty is that the conversation refused to crawl back under the rug. Organizations coalesce around the new frankness. The word Malthusian enters meeting notices and a league takes shape for those who believe that prudence in reproduction belongs in the same column as thrift and clean water. Pamphlets blossom that tell practical stories in straightforward language. A companion tract by Besant titled The Law of Population aims lower in price and wider in reach, designed for readers who can spare minutes at a kitchen table after the children sleep. The tone is kind and stubborn. It acknowledges that the closest thing to a luxury in some households is a quiet night. Opponents do not stay home. Clergy publish responses that describe the divine order of families and the danger of placing human hands on a mechanism they consider sacred. Physicians divide, some welcoming accurate information, others insisting that restraint is the only honorable method and that devices and washes invite moral decay. Politicians perform a careful dance because voters dislike being treated as if they cannot think. Newspapers rehearse stock phrases about the social fabric, then follow with delicious summaries of the court speeches they claim should never have been spoken aloud. At a bookseller's counter you watch a strange choreography. Customers ask for titles in voices pitched just below embarrassment. The clerk lifts the requested pamphlet from a stack kept beneath a moral treatise, as if the two together might cancel each other out. Prices are low on principle, but costs must be paid, so supporters buy extra to pass along to cousins and neighbors. A mother scans a page as if it were a map that might show a path through a forest where grocery lists and pregnancies chase each other in circles. She folds the paper with the care of a letter and tucks it into her bodice like a warrant for a better night's sleep. The quieter ripple of the case is inside marriages. A husband who once treated family size as a matter of drift now counts wages and months between illnesses and asks new questions with a kind voice. A wife who learned to measure her strength against laundry, washing day, and winter fuel keeps her own calendar and insists on methods that are within her reach. Not every household agrees on tools. Some prefer sheaths and find a discreet chemist. Some prefer sponges and syringes that promise more control. Some prefer calculation and longer walks on certain evenings. Joke too smooths its collar. If romance cannot survive a conversation about money and calendars, it probably should not be left alone with the crockery. There is scandal in this too. Caricatures parade Bradlaugh and Besant as corrupters of youth, as if a leaflet could do more harm than hunger. Letters to editors thunder about the slippery slope where modesty is supposed to hold the line. Then, on the same page, an advertisement sells an invigorating tonic whose benefits are phrased with commas that wink. The contradiction does not embarrass the paper. Contradictions do not blush. You visit a printer shop where type warms under gaslight and the compositor whistles through missing teeth. He sets lines for a fresh run and talks about the peculiarity of words. He says some words behave like cats. They will not come when called. They push the door open themselves and sit on your paper even if you do not want them there. Knowledge about bodies behaves like that. Bolt the door and it finds a window. Lock the window and it comes down the chimney with the soot. He grins, sets the last full stop, and pulls a proof with blackened fingers. The legacy of the case settles into ordinary life rather than monuments. Public debate keeps flaring, but the most durable change is the steady availability of print that treats reproduction as a subject adults can discuss without theatrics. For many readers, the pamphlet is less a trumpet than a lamp. It does not shout. It lets you see the furniture so you stop bumping your shins. Historians still argue whether the long-term effect was to normalize barrier methods or to accelerate a broader turn towards smaller families for economic reasons that would have arrived anyway. What everyone can agree on is the sound of a door opening. A boy outside the court that started it all sells yet another edition of the speeches to a couple who smile like people who have found a sentence they needed. The city exhales the way it does after rain. The pamphlet returns to pockets and drawers. The judge's words fade compared to the quiet decision made at kitchen tables where lamp oil is precious and sleep is dear. Joke 3 straightens its vest. If common sense had a printing press, it would look exactly like this one. Ink under the nails and just enough coins in the tin to buy tomorrow's paper. You open a bedroom door that looks like a painting of good intentions. The wallpaper wears roses that never wilt. The washstand waits with folded towels that believe in sincerity. The bed is wide, high, and guarded by drapery that pretends privacy is a fabric you can buy by the yard. Respectability breathes in here with lavender on its breath. The room has a reputation to protect and a quiet truth to manage. Because marriage is not only a ceremony and a cake, it is also a legal machine that turns 2 lives into 1 ledger. On the dressing table sits a small box for trinkets, and beside it a marriage settlement folded like an origami swan. The paper speaks the language of coverture, a doctrine that imagines a husband and wife as one legal person, and the one is usually him. That is the mainstream fact the room never says out loud. Property brought into a marriage tends to slide into the husband's pocket unless specific documents say otherwise. The doctrine sounds tender in theory and heavy in practice, and furniture does not object. Furniture only holds the weight it is given. A chimney draught carries the smell of coal, and the housemaid's step fades down the corridor. You study the other papers under the swan. A newer layer peeks out, signed by a solicitor with a steady hand. It belongs to the Married Women's Property Acts that begin in 1870 and expand in 1882. Reforms that let a wife own wages she earns and property she acquires after marriage. A change that sounds modest until you imagine a woman buying a chair without permission and the chair actually being hers. The law shifts like a mattress after a long night. It is still lumpy. It is slightly kinder to the backbone. 2 straight-back chairs stand near the fire like chaperones who never clock off. They have witnessed more diplomacy than some embassies. In this room, negotiation lives in tones of voice, in the time it takes to snuff a candle, in the distance between pillows. A faint stack of discreet pamphlets hides under the quilt. Practical pages that promise to answer questions no aunt will take. Quirky tidbit steps out with a blush. Some of these marriage manuals are published by doctors who pretend they are writing about health in the abstract, then calmly explain bedding, timing, and the difference between romance on a stage and romance in a room with cold feet. The law keeps one eye on the bed and one eye on the street. It used to require Parliament itself to unmake a marriage, a private act with the weight of a miracle, which put freedom out of reach for most wallets. Then the 1857 Matrimonial Causes Act creates a civil court where dissolving a union still favors husbands who may petition for a wife's adultery alone, while wives must prove adultery plus cruelty or another serious fault. That test is a sieve with a strong opinion. Historians still argue whether the new court truly opened a door for ordinary people or merely changed the wallpaper on old power. The court sits in Somerset House and pretends to be neutral while listening for sins in the key of evidence. Near the wardrobe hangs a pair of nightgowns with identical ribbons. You notice a fashion that will become a story of its own. Separate beds, twin islands with a rug between, begin to appear in respectable rooms. The trend is about ventilation, spinal health, and a preference for tidy sleep, at least according to advertisements. It is also about the negotiation of nightly expectation. 2 beds make room for yes and no without anyone having to cough politely into a candle. Joke 1 fluffs a pillow. If architecture could solve every conversation, carpenters would receive medals. A small prayer book sits on the bedside table next to a little bottle of cologne. Between them rests a folded writ for restitution of conjugal rights, an old legal tool that allows a spouse to ask the court to order the other to resume cohabitation. The phrase sounds antique and courteous, but its edge is sharp. If ignored, it can lead to consequences that chase dignity from the room. One notorious dispute ends in 1891 when a court frees a wife who had been confined by her husband after he seized her for obedience. Cases like that illuminate the distance between the poetry of vows and the prose of enforcement. Children's boots line up by the skirting board like punctuation marks. Custody law once treated those boots as an extension of paternal authority. Yet reform winds creep under the door. The Custody of Infants acts earlier in the century to begin to recognize a mother's claims, especially for young children. The shift is incremental and contested like most good ideas when they first learn to walk. A mother still needs persistence and allies. A father still finds the law answering his knock faster than hers. Dinner carries on either way, and boots still need polish. You cross to the fireplace and find a letter from a cousin. Advice folded inside like a handkerchief. It mentions magistrates who can grant a separation order after proof of aggravated assault, a power that arrives with later statutes to ease danger quickly for some wives. The order offers protection and maintenance, and it reminds a household that bread and bruises are not an acceptable blend. The legal language is dry. The effect can be warm, a bed that is finally only a bed. There is a hush around another topic, the kind that chooses its words carefully and often chooses none. Marital consent sits like a shadow behind the curtains. The old legal assumption that a wife consents by the act of marrying is not challenged in courtrooms of this era, the way it will be in a later century. The silence is practical, fearful, and bolstered by sermons about duty. Inside marriages, couples make their own treaties. Some reach a graceful rhythm that balances tenderness and tiredness. Some trade schedules and signals that look like embroidery to an outsider and feel like autonomy on the inside. Joke 2 checks the mantel clock. If respect came in canisters, even the worst arguments would end with a toast. In the press, domestic advice columns dress themselves in flowers and talk about harmony with a smile that hides calluses. They recommend patience, good meals, gentle correction, and the avoidance of harsh words. A few brave texts mention cruelty in rooms that appear to outsiders like postcards of peace. They suggest keeping a small coin for emergency cab fare and writing a friend's address in pencil inside the prayer book. The realism blushes. The advice is not silly. It reads like a ladder stored under the bed for use only when the smoke is thick. The household ledger lives in the writing desk. It is a heavy volume filled with flower prices and coal deliveries. Yet it is also a diary of intimacy. When money grows thin, affection sometimes learns new choreography. Couples choose spacing, restraint, or devices purchased in careful whispers. Some use those choices to strengthen alliance. Some quarrel because a budget feels like an arrival. Here the law never reaches. Here policy becomes habit. And habit decides whether mornings feel like new starts or like repeats. You run your fingers along the mantel where 3 hairwork rings rest beside the clock. Sentimental tokens thrive in homes that speak softly about big things. The angel in the house ideal circulates in verses that ask a wife to be dew, light, balm, and several other weather systems. The ideal looks very pretty and can be exhausting to maintain. Real rooms pair angelic expectations with practical lists. Boil the sheets on Monday. Air the rooms on Tuesday. Write to the coal merchant. Remind the person across the mattress that kindness belongs to evening as much as to Sunday. Joke 3 straightens the bedspread. If perfection were a housekeeping task, it would be the one everyone kept forgetting to put on the list. The bedroom never appears in a court report unless something has gone wrong. Yet it anchors the greater part of ordinary happiness. Couples invent private languages for consent, for pleasure, for decline. They develop calendars that nod to headaches, harvests, and holidays. They learn that privacy is a skill. They discover that listening is a better recipe than laudanum for certain storms. Historians still argue whether small shifts in law changed bedrooms first, or whether bedrooms changed law by sending their exasperations out through petitions and sisters' letters until Parliament finally heard them. The argument is tidy on paper. It is messier where quilts are folded each morning. You draw the curtains and watch the city's light lace itself across the bedspread. The room holds a candlestick, a jug, and 2 book spines that pretend to be about botany and are actually about marriage. The law writes rules with ink. Hearts write edits with routine. Somewhere downstairs, someone latches the front door for the night. Somewhere up here, 2 people decide how to share the space between pillows in a way that peace can afford. The clock ticks without judging anyone at all. You walk along a street where charity signs glow like halos and door knockers look as serious as sermons. A bell rings somewhere with brisk confidence. The words on everyone's lips are "fallen women," a phrase so heavy it needs 2 hands to lift it. You turn into a courtyard where laundry steam rises like a cloud of good intentions. Aprons flap on lines. A matron's keys jingle. The promise on the brass plate reads "home," though rules hang in the air like extra curtains. Inside the vestibule, a ledger waits with names copied in a careful hand. Some entries arrive with a story about rescue at the last possible minute. Others arrive with fewer details and a worn pair of boots. Relief societies write pamphlets that make these doorways sound like small arcs bobbing bravely on a flood of city temptations. The mainstream fact sits politely at the desk. Under the New Poor Law of 1834, workhouses become the official safety net for destitute people, and thousands of women pass through their gates, where tasks like picking oakum and scrubbing linen fill long days in exchange for hard beds and coarse meals. Workhouses are practical machines. Rescue homes add a language of moral repair to the same basic architecture of discipline and labor. You step into a laundry room where steam turns the rafters into a misty chapel. Irons hiss. Soap smells like fresh beginnings and like drudgery. The matron explains the schedule without smiling. Rising bell, prayers, breakfast, work, more prayers. Silence in corridors, letters inspected. Visitors limited and sometimes never. The logic is simple. Structure heals what freedom has bruised. Historians still argue whether these institutions offered sanctuary that saved lives, or primarily enforced middle-class ideas about female respectability under a pious roof. The debate tracks along every corridor tile because both truths can live in the same building on the same afternoon. The girl at the mangle glances up, cheeks pink from heat rather than embarrassment. She arrived with a coat that smelled of river, fog, and gin. She now owns an apron with a number in neat ink. Numbers sit better in ledgers than names that come with complicated pasts. Another resident stitches buttons by a window where light behaves like kindness. Her story comes in small parcels: a bad situation, a worse landlord, a promise that turned out to be a translation error between hope and rent. She says the food is plain, the rules are strict, and the laundry does not ask unanswerable questions. Joke 1 wipes its hands. If the path to redemption runs on starch, this iron is halfway to sainthood. Penitentiaries for women organize work with the gravity of a clock tower. Some use the silent system for hours at a time, a drill borrowed from prisons, where speech is rationed to keep temptation from recruiting allies. The silence is not empty. It is full of thoughts that never got a hearing. A chapel beckons with texts about forgiveness, then pairs those texts with inspection rounds that notice badly folded sheets. The contradiction is built into the brickwork. You can forgive and still demand corners sharp enough to cut paper. The wall in the hall displays samplers embroidered with verses and dates. Needlework serves as proof that skills are being restored as well as souls. Quilts made by the residents appear at charity bazaars where donors admire tiny stitches and imagine the moral neatness they represent. A quirky tidbit peeks from a donation box. Some homes issue little paper tickets that can be exchanged for small privileges like extra reading time or a ribbon for Sunday. An economy of merit that turns virtue into coupons and gives the matron a budget in smiles. You cross to a workhouse that belongs to the parish rather than a society. The receiving room smells of damp wool and decisions. Women surrender their clothes for a bath and a uniform, a ritual that nods at cleanliness and insists on equality. The master assigns dormitories. The mistress assigns tasks. Meals are a study in monotony that nutritionists of the era diagnose as adequate if not inspired. The workhouse does not promise to mend hearts. It promises only to prevent starvation at the price of liberty. Couples split into separate wards. Mothers keep infants if the board agrees, and if the cost does not tip the ledger into worry. The model prefers economies that can be added up at the end of the quarter. Not all rescue work is laundry and silence. A small mission house on a side street offers tea, bread, and a seat that does not ask questions. Volunteers organize evening classes in writing and arithmetic. A friendly deaconess teaches millinery so a resident can handle feathers and felt instead of boiling water that clouds her lungs. A medical officer visits with a bag of practical kindness and a face that refuses to flinch. In the corner, a shelf holds novels that pass inspection and a thin volume of poetry that everyone pretends not to read because it makes the room feel too large. Stories about ruined travel faster than the women they describe. Newspapers love a moral arc that starts with seduction and ends with forgiveness, preferably in time for the morning edition. Donors prefer narratives with a clean turning point. A scene at a dangerous doorway where a firm hand and a plain dress alter destiny. The truth is usually untidier. People come and go. Improvement looks like 3 steps forward and 2 sideways. A resident disappears after payday and returns 3 weeks later with a cough that whispers winter. The matron makes her a bed anyway. She scolds because that is the rule, and she tucks because that is the rule too. A prison inspector visits a female reformatory and takes notes in upright handwriting about order, sobriety, and the commendable reduction in chatter. He measures success by the number of women placed in domestic service after discharge. Some placements are kind, others are a new uniform for an old dependency. A cook throws a pan. A housemaid learns how to ignore unpleasant hands because she needs her wages to feed a little boy being kept by a neighbor. The metrics look good on paper. Lives look different from the kitchen stairs. Joke 2 adjusts the spectacles on the inspector's nose. If neat columns were proof of virtue, ledgers would preach better sermons than chaplains. Magdalene institutions operate in several towns with a blend of penitence and industry. Their literature speaks of penitence and conversions. Their daily life speaks of soap and tired wrists. Residents sometimes take new Christian names for the duration of their stay and attempt to let the past fall away like an old shawl. Names are powerful tools. They protect, they erase. They allow a woman to go into service with less baggage or to vanish into the city with more chances. The city tends to be kind to people who can carry small stories without dropping them. On the edge of these efforts lives a black economy of protection that looks like charity and acts like commerce. A lodging housekeeper supplies cheap meals and a blanket to women who are always one rent day from the curb. She does not ask where the coins come from. She does not issue lectures. She knows that appetite and pity both need supper. The doorstep of those houses is a classroom in practical ethics that no society pamphlet quotes. Hovering over everything is the tale of the fallen woman itself, a script borrowed from pulp fiction and sermons. She is imagined as a singular figure who plunged once and forever. Real people are not singular. Real lives bend and turn. Some take shelter, learn a trade, and build quiet futures that never announce themselves. Some shuttle between safety and risk because stability is a ladder with missing rungs. Some discover that marriage with a patient man is the safest refuge, even if society tries to pretend it is a reward. Some become matrons themselves and set kinder rules than they endured. Historians still argue whether public fascination with ruin created more sympathy or more surveillance, and whether donations bought beds or simply bought a flattering story about the donors. You pause at a doorway where a girl hesitates with a parcel in her arms. The parcel wriggles. It is a baby wrapped in a shawl so clean it must be new. The porter lifts the latch. The matron nods. The rules include clauses for infants that sound like footnotes in a book about storms. A bottle is warmed. A cot is made ready. The building becomes less of an idea and more of a room that rearranges itself around a smaller heartbeat. The girl exhales. The baby sneezes and decides to keep living. A bell announces evening prayers. Voices rise in a key that suggests tiredness more than rapture. Afterward, the dormitory fills with the rustle of blankets and the private sound of someone promising herself a different morning. The city outside does not debate the merits of rescue. It sleeps when it can. Inside these walls, people practice that same art with mixed success. Some will leave by spring, some will leave before dawn, some will return years later with a basket of buns and a smile that says thank you in a language more honest than a report. Joke 3 tips a cap to the steam clouds. If redemption has a costume today, it is an apron that smells of soap and the faintest trace of courage. You follow a drumbeat that sounds more like coin against coin than stick against skin. Payday has slid across the calendar, and uniforms pour into the streets with the assurance of men who have no pockets deep enough for tonight. The city wears epaulets after dark, barracks empty into canteens. Canteens spill into music halls, and the music halls lean toward the docks the way sunflowers lean toward light. Boots thud a rhythm any tavern pianist can play in his sleep. The map of pleasure redraws itself around garrison towns and naval ports. Names that feel like brass on the tongue: Aldershot, Colchester, Portsmouth, Chatham, Plymouth. You match your pace to their swagger and learn to read the alphabet of sleeve stripes. At the corner, the sergeant of the day looks like a man who can see tomorrow's duty roster through a wall. He reminds a corporal to bring his lads back inside at tattoo, the bugle call that pretends nightlife has a curfew. The reminder is a hope, not a forecast. In truth, the streets are a new parade ground where rank relaxes but never vanishes. Soldiers still fall into informal files, and you can tell who polished their buttons the longest by how fast doors open for them. Mainstream fact keeps time with the drum. The Victorian Army is a permanent force living in large depots by mid-century, especially after the Cardwell reforms of the early 1870s that reorganized service terms and established linked battalions with regimental depots, which means more soldiers sleeping near towns that offer distraction at competitive prices. Naval shore leave moves with a different gait. Sailors step as if the ground might decide to tilt. Liberty men collect in clusters and discuss the two topics liberty always brings: food and entertainment. They line up at Chandler's for sweets the color of flags, at pie sellers for slices heavy with pepper, and at tattooists whose windows advertise anchors, swallows, and the names of women who may or may not be permanent. Quirky tidbit pricks the skin and winks. Some dockside artists mix pigments with a dash of gin for bravery and antisepsis, selling a two-in-one that would make a pharmacist sigh and a sailor grin. A mission hall near the harbour offers hot coffee, hymn tunes and letters home written by volunteers with patient hands. The seaman's mission hangs a blue lamp and promises a bed that does not move. Next door, a public house promises the opposite and adds a fiddle. You watch the two doors compete serenely, each confident that its customer will find the right threshold. On a wall, a poster warns about the clap with a severity meant to rival the sergeant major. The language is clean. The concern is real. Historians still argue whether temperance societies and missions truly redirected substantial numbers of shoregoers or mainly served those already inclined toward quiet. While the majority treated sermons as background music to the main event is variety. Music halls pack the benches until the aisles look like rivers of hats. Performers tease and twirl under gaslight. Comic singers promise a chorus everyone can grasp by the second verse. Dancers collect flowers that are sometimes invitations folded very small. Soldiers clap offbeat and do not apologize. Sailors stomp in time and apologize for nothing. A ticket is cheap, liquor is not, and the arithmetic suits a private with fresh wages. Joke one tips its cap. If applause could be bottled, the army would never need rum again. You drift to a street where lodging houses advertise clean beds and discreet exits. Here business is a duet with rules. Knock lightly, pay in advance. No names, only a nod. The Contagious Diseases Acts have left their imprint on port towns, but tonight the law prefers to loiter rather than interrupt. Inside, a landlady keeps order with the efficiency of a quartermaster. Candles are rationed, towels are counted, trouble meets a broom handle before it tries anything else. The scale runs from cheap rooms with a blanket that knows too many stories to private apartments with thick curtains and brandy that claims to be French. Another block is a sailor's district in miniature. Barbers stay open late, offering brisk shaves and hair singeing to quiet flyaway ends. Pawnbrokers take watches at a rate that assumes the watch wishes to come home on Monday. Outfitters sell neckerchiefs in colors that make swagger look like uniform. You listen to the lingua franca of the night shift. Leave ends at Reve. Liberty boat departs on the half hour. Last orders at the taproom before the shore patrol sweeps. The patrol walks with deliberate slowness, a pace designed to give everyone time to choose wisdom without losing face. Cards slap on wooden tables, coins stack in hopeful towers, and a corner hosts a boxing match that pretends to be spontaneous, but has a man at the door collecting bets with a conscience like a lockbox. A drummer boy holds the bucket for the wages and learns mathematics at a speed his schoolmaster would envy. Flags on the ceiling remind everyone to cheer for their own regiment and to find the exit quickly if they forget. The room smells like beer, rosin, and ambition. Joke 2 tightens its gloves. If discipline could be taught with fisticuffs alone, every colonel would build a ring between the mess and the parade square. You pass an alley where a fiddler plays tunes that sound like home for counties you have never visited. 2 soldiers dance badly on purpose so the girl with the shawl will laugh, and she does. She also negotiates because the street is a marketplace of small bargains where wit pays as well as beauty. She knows the guard change times, the last ferry, and the name of the corporal who can be talked around if everyone stays cheerful. She also knows where to find broth at dawn that might keep a man steady enough to climb a gangplank. On the quayside, a shipping clerk checks a ledger and speaks in a voice that tolerates no drama. Sailors must return sober enough to salute and steady enough to climb. The boatswain balances sternness with a promise of coffee on board, which in this harbour is strong enough to revive a saint. Some do not make it. They find a bench, a doorway, or a pawnshop's friendly chair and vow to be better tomorrow. The shore patrol gathers strays like a shepherd gathers sheep, which is to say with practice and a minimum of fuss. Conversation in corners turns toward money, then turns toward disease, then turns back to money. A private boasts of a pay packet that will shrink to a story by morning. A stoker waves off a caution by quoting a story that begins with a friend and ends with a bad clinic. Clerks at lock hospitals speak of weeks that look the same, a rhythm of treatments, discharges, and the same faces returning like tides. Historians still argue whether concentrated military presence in towns increased rates of infection significantly, compared to civilian averages, or whether the same appetite simply became more counted because uniform makes counting easier. The numbers wear coats and argue with each other in the rain. The docks have entertainments that ignore uniforms altogether. Penny gaffs offer crude plays where heroes are always noisy and villains are always tidy. Street photographers pose couples in front of painted ships and make souvenirs that will travel around the world folded inside sea chests. A vendor sells hot eels, which are allegedly fortifying, and winkles that come with pins as if courage needed a small spear. Quirky tidbit lifts a lid. Some vendors swear that a mug of porter with a floating raw egg can restore manly vigor on a timetable so optimistic it deserves its own military band. A quieter economy moves beside the loud one. Dressmakers run accounts for regulars who prefer their collars small and their cuffs perfect when walking out. Landladies keep a ledger of men who settle their bills ahead of sailing because a warm reputation is as useful as a warm blanket. When the wind shifts, a photographer in a side lane specializes in cartes de visite to be posted to families with notes that say, "I am well, tell the dog to be good." The dog never reads the card, but the family keeps it in a drawer like a promise. Close to midnight, the city changes key. Some doors close, others open. A few lock from the inside with firmness that explains itself. The music halls release their last chorus into the street. The mission bell calls once, low and kind. The bugle at the barracks calls out tattoo with more confidence. Steps quicken. A sergeant counts heads at the gate and discovers that his arithmetic depends on luck and the speed of cabs. The harbour horn answers from the water, a note that tells the tide to mind the timetable. You linger on a stone step and let the two currents of the night cross over your shoes. Uniforms give people a script, and the city supplies the stage directions. Everyone here plays a part written by wages, by weather, by the recent rumour of posting to somewhere far away. Jokes calm trouble before it starts. Songs glue strangers into choruses long enough for them to call each other mate and mean it. If order is a barracks word and pleasure a port word, then the streets between them translate both with admirable speed. Joke 3 salutes the lamplighter. If diplomacy always worked this well, every treaty would be signed outside a music hall with a drum roll and a promise to be back by Reveille. You step into St. James's, where pavements gleam like polished boots and doorways practice discretion for a living. Brass plates whisper names that carry as far as Parliament, and a porter in quiet livery studies you with an expression that has seen everything and recorded nothing. You pass under a fanlight and into a hall that smells of leather, wood polish, and the faintest ghost of cigar smoke. A clock ticks as if it were paid by the second. Inside these walls, men learn to speak in an accent made of understatement and to hide appetites behind napkins folded like lilies. A steward glides forward and takes your hat. He knows your tailor, your club account, and how to procure an oyster supper at midnight without involving a menu. Members drift through rooms where newsprint rustles like dry leaves. A reading table heaves with papers from every capital. The fire mutters to itself. In the card room, chairs are drawn close enough for whispers to feel like companions. The mainstream fact shines from a portrait above the mantel. This city grows dozens of gentlemen's clubs across the 19th century, concentrated along Pall Mall and St. James's, from Whites and Brookses for old Whig and Tory tribes, to newer houses like the Reform and the Carlton that double as political launchpads, with the Garricks serving actors and admirers who pretend the stage is a private office. In the bay window at White's, members keep the bow window occupied as if it were a throne with multiple seats. The betting book lies open, thick as a family Bible, ready to record wagers on politics, fortunes, and the fate of raindrops sliding down a pane during a slow afternoon. Quirky Tidbit turns the pages and grins. Men have been known to stake sums on whether a gentleman will marry by Michaelmas or whether a certain dignitary will outlive his doctor. Entries that stand beside serious wagers, as if nonsense were simply a twin of policy. The dining room teaches another grammar. Waiters understand coded orders better than lexicographers. A gentleman asks for the brown sherry with a pause after brown that means something else entirely. Perhaps a private bottle produced from a sideboard that is not on any list. A request for a late supper might arrive with a folded card that causes the steward to assign an upstairs cabinet and a hallway sentry who coughs at helpful moments. Jokes trim their cuffs. If courtesy were a currency, every head waiter in this district would fund a canal. You move to a smoking room where talk is woven from half-stories and shortened names. A politician pretends to read a dispatch while a backbencher pretends not to angle for a committee. A wine merchant's son eases a new vintage into the fellowship by praising its ancestry. You notice silence at certain words. Names of well-known actresses are pronounced with a gloved hand. The phrase special dinner is understood as a package that includes a private room and a cab summoned from a muse not listed in the directory. Historians still argue whether such clubs primarily engineered policy behind closed doors or simply provided a padded refuge where men escaped their families and played at importance until the bell for breakfast. Behind the velvet, the city conducts a parallel business. Private dining rooms at fashionable restaurants offer velvet curtains, single doors, and a bell pull with an efficient rope. Cabinet particulier, borrowed from Paris, arrive in London with euphemisms in their luggage. You enter one where a portrait of a duchess keeps careful watch and a sideboard hides a second door. Here, coded talk smooths every transaction. A guest asks for extra candles to mean more privacy. Another requests the chef's attention to mean a bottle not intended for accounting. The waiter agrees, and his discretion receives an envelope at the end of the night that feels heavier than gratitude. A carriage waits in a mews where cab lamps are shaded. A woman steps down with the balance of someone who knows stairs and the art of pretending to be surprised by them. She is an independent contractor of charm, an expert in conversation that makes men feel taller than their reflections. She belongs to a registry kept in a notebook that never appears in court. Her terms are high, her boundaries clean. The commerce here admires control more than romance. A madam in Mayfair coordinates schedules as if she were managing a small railway, ensuring that important members never discover that their timepieces run on the same timetable. The garret glows with theatrical warmth. In a corner, a comic actor holds court without leaving his chair, practicing a new story for a later audience. Prints of stars stare down from the walls with an air of private complicity. Members invite supper with performers whose names are repeated as if they were spells. Everyone acts as if gossip were nothing more than polite air. It is not. It is currency traded by the inch and redeemed by the line. Joke too taps the ash from a cigar. If reputation could be printed on vellum, half the room would ask for a second copy to carry in a pocket for emergencies. A valet whisks through with the confidence of a man who knows every Stain's biography. He carries letters sealed in scarlet wax and messages tucked into hope. Club servants operate as a secure postal service that never issues stamps. They arrange doctors who do not frown and carriages that arrive from streets where nobody looks out of the window. The committee of a club oversees civility and quietly oversees memory. Names can be erased from the dining book without needing to be erased from the membership roll. A courtesy extended when sudden absence is a kindness for everyone. The card room at Brooks's holds a hum that sounds like bees and semantics. Hazard, whist and newer games gather fortunes in tidy stacks. A loser promises himself reform. A winner purchases the solid feeling that he deserves his opinions. The betting book receives another entry and the room agrees to pretend it matters. Behind the jokes runs a thread of danger. Blackmailers study this district like naturalists studying weather. A letter with 2 initials and a time can command more coin than a season's harvest. A single careless note left at a table can make a solicitor very busy. The club's best defense is to keep panic out of the minutes and to pay certain bills with the speed that stops curiosity. In a Turkish bath near Jermyn Street, you feel the heat loosen tongues and shoulders alike. Bathers lie on stone slabs while attendants pour water with a ceremony that is part health and part theatre. Steam turns faces into masks, then turns masks into faces again. Here, confidences are exchanged with less risk of ink. A gentleman may arrange an introduction to a singer or settle an old debt in fewer words than it takes to order a cut of beef. The bathkeeper knows everything and refuses to know anything at all. Quirky detail drifts with the steam. Some patrons swear by eucalyptus leaves pressed under the chin to keep the voice low and smoky for a supper that requires charm. Architecture itself plays along. Staircases wind in patterns that keep encounters accidental only when wanted. Mirrors are placed to prevent surprises. A side door opens to a mews where a small stable boy dozes on a stool and wakes only for familiar signals. The entire quarter operates like an orchestra with a conductor who insists on pianissimo. When noise intrudes, it is treated as a breach of etiquette rather than a breach of law. Not everything glitters. A clerk from the reform sits in a corner worrying a bill. He is not ruined, not yet. He needs an introduction. He needs a vote in a committee room where members behave as if they were born to nod at the right moment. The club can rescue or ignore that hinge between salvation and indifference is the honest metal of these halls. Historians still argue whether clubs preserved merit by cultivating informal mentorship or stifled it by making patronage look like fellowship with better wallpaper. Night deepens. The steward dims lamps to indicate propriety. A porter yawns without opening his mouth. A carriage waits for someone who never arrives. You sign the dinner book with a hand that looks less guilty than it feels. The air tastes of toast crumbs and secrets. Jokes take their hats. If wisdom were a side dish, it would arrive late and be eaten cold with a polite smile. Outside the street breathes cool air over hot stories. Behind you, cards are gathered and folded napkins make little snowy hills. Ahead, backrooms and cabinets quietly reset the tableware for lives that need a small stage without an audience. You step into the night with your collar up and your face arranged in the expression that says nothing happened. The city agrees to believe you because believing you keeps every doorbell polite and every porter employed. You turn down a quiet street where curtains look thicker than fabric and footsteps learn to tread like punctuation. The air has the weight of secrets that refuse to behave. A door opens after 2 knocks and a pause. A rhythm agreed upon by people who cannot afford to be careless. Inside the parlor looks like any other respectable room until your eye learns to read the code. A lily in a vase. A print of a Greek statue that lingers a touch too long on the ankle. A piano with songs that gather men into harmony and then hush them when the hallway creaks. Tonight belongs to friendship that is also flame, to longing that must rehearse its innocence in case the law requests a performance. Conversation slips along lines that look like ordinary gossip and feel like lifelines. A man in a night black suit tells a story about a club in Piccadilly where laughter sits in the bow window and discretion in the stairwell. Another sketches a map of parks and paths where twilight recognizes regulars and police boots learn which gravel makes the loudest sound. The room is careful, but it is not joyless. Hands find hands when the lamp is adjusted. Smiles find reasons that are never printed. This is the city's quiet mathematics, the proof that hearts continue their lessons even when textbooks are banned. History introduces itself without asking permission. The Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885 contains a late clause by Henry Labouche that criminalizes gross indecency between males. Whether public or private, a mainstream fact that rearranges evening plans across 1,000 rooms. The wording is as wide as fog. It catches letters, glances, and arrangements that once slipped through legal fingers. Men learn to write as if a judge will read every adjective. The postman becomes an uninvited editor. Telegraph boys become hazards or accomplices depending on the tip. You listen to a friend explain how ordinary small talk now feels like stepping stones across a fast river. Blackmail thrives in climates like this. A single note with a neat hand and an unsigned name can empty wallets and drain sleep for months. A clerk who knows a schedule. A messenger who knows a doorway. A landlady who knows the habit of returning late and cheerful. Each becomes a potential author of invoices that never meet an accountant. The practice has its own etiquette. Pay it once and the notes stop. Pay twice and the notes learn to breed. Joke 1 twirls a calling card. If terror were a business, half the city would be drawing dividends. You are handed a buttonhole flower. It is a carnation dyed green, frivolous and defiant. A bit of theatre that pretends to be only theatre. Quirky tidbit whispers out of a cuff. Certain circles in the 1890s favor that splash of green as a wink of fellowship. Not universal by any means, yet bright enough that a waiter might raise an eyebrow and a friend might smile in relief. Slang also does its share of lifting. Polari drifts through music halls and informal networks. All curls and quicks. A cant that can praise a handsome omi or warn of a lurking Palone with just enough mystery to pass through suspicious air. A more public drama unfolds in a courtroom where hats bloom like orchids and the gallery arrives early. The name that fills the room is a playwright with a smile made for lamplight and a wit that snaps like fine thread. A marquee's calling card, a club, a sentence scribbled with malice and later crossed. And then the trials arrive like thunderheads. Oscar Wilde faces prosecution in 1895 for gross indecency. The rooms fill with theatrical tension and the verdict delivers hard time in a prison with a name readers will come to know from a poem. The spectacle is a lighthouse that warns, and it is also a bonfire that draws faces too close. Lives near the heat learn to turn away sooner. Outside the parlor, men practice survival with the precision usually reserved for chess. Rendezvous are arranged in coded letters that discuss books or birds. Introductions happen through cousins who are not cousins, through pianists who play for private recitals, through photographers who know which backdrop to lower, through waiters who cultivate clients as if they were rare wines. Historians still argue whether a coherent subculture fully coheres in this decade, or whether overlapping circles of class, profession and taste merely touch, sharing argot and doorways without forming a single world. The answer changes with neighborhoods and with the price of entry. Policing wears two faces. One is the constable who knows his beat and prefers peace to headlines, who clears a park discreetly at dusk and hopes to avoid paperwork. The other is the detective who hunts for scandal with the patience of a fisherman, who prefers a charge sheet that reads like an essay, who sets traps with young men coached to listen, to smile, to testify. The press magnifies the latter because sales tally easier when names sit beside verbs like expose or ruin. Families suffer rehearsed shock. Employers practice surprise. Solicitors practice damage control that sounds like a hymn and bills like a symphony. The law's net has distorting force. A friendship is read as a conspiracy. A poem is cited as evidence. A dinner becomes a document. Some men retreat into marriages that promise camouflage and carry kindness if they are fortunate. Some reconfigure their lives around hotels with registers that leave out details. Some leave for cities with different languages where they will learn to order breakfast beside people who do not ask questions they cannot afford to answer. Joke 2 straightens a tie. If safety had a passport, the stamp would read somewhere no one knows your tailor. Not every story ends in flight or prison. Some end in stubborn domesticity that refuses to apologize. 2 bachelors share rooms and a piano for decades and become uncles to everyone's children. 2 artists keep addresses close to each other so often that the post office learns to deliver invitations in pairs. An antiques dealer and a musician cultivate a tea ritual at 4 that nobody thinks to interrupt. These arrangements are not slogans. They are weathered timber that holds up roofs. Their dignity is a kind of argument the courtroom cannot hear. Letters carry both risk and rescue. A line from a friend in Paris offers a season of calm. A postcard from Capri shows water too blue to be legal and an invitation hidden between waves. A note sent by careful hand asks if you will walk at 6 past the statue that looks away and decide whether to live with a little more courage. The stamp is a hazard. The envelope is a lifeboat. Hands shake less when tea is hot, and the window faces a courtyard where no one can see. The theater goes on speaking even when it tries not to. Comic skits toss sly lines that bounce once and vanish into laughter. Serious plays dress desire in antique robes and invite the audience to applaud history while the present sits 3 rows back taking notes. A certain writer's paradoxes continue to tour drawing rooms even while their author sleeps on iron. People chuckle and quote and discover that repeating wit is a method of breathing in tight spaces. Medical opinion does not help much. A few writers insist that inversion is an inborn temperament and therefore asks for understanding rather than punishment. Others wield charts and theories that promise to identify dangerous types and correct them with results that mostly prove that certainty is a fashionable disease. The arguments fill journals and leave parlors to get on with the delicate business of staying human. Historians still argue whether those early psychological texts softened public hostility or furnished police and blackmailers with new vocabulary to sharpen their work. Language is a tool that does not choose its user. Midnight slides a finger along the window glass. The parlor quiets. A host puts away the teacups as carefully as if they were affidavits. Coats are buttoned. The agreed-upon distances for walking apart on the pavement are observed. A policeman nods without seeing. A cab driver concentrates on reins and ignores the rest. Doors close with the soft armor of habit. The city returns to its ordinary dream of respectability, while a quieter dream continues in rooms where hands find each other and refuse to let go. Joke 3 sets the lamp wick low. If hope were illegal, the charge sheet would be longer than the street. It is not, at least not tonight. Tonight you step back into the night air, and the stars behave themselves for once, keeping their counsel while shoes tap a private rhythm only you can hear. You slip into a music hall where gaslight polishes brass rails and the orchestra pit smells like rosin and optimism. The stage curtain shivers. The chairman bangs his gavel with the flourish of a toastmaster and outstrides a figure in a neat frock coat. Cane tapping time. The voice is bright, the wink is practiced, and the swagger is studied until it looks natural. You realize the gentleman is a lady and the audience loves her for being better at being a man than half the men in the cheap seats. The principal boy of pantomime and the music hall male impersonator share this footboard citizenship. Vesta Tilly ascends to celebrity in the later decades of the century, while earlier Annie Handel sings in trousers that fit the melody. The mainstream fact behind the applause is simple. British stages make cross-dressing a tradition, with women playing breeches roles and principal boys and men donning the fat suit and paint of the pantomime dame, all sanctioned by tickets and encore calls. Backstage pins glint like fish bones in a tin. A dresser tightens a belt, smooths a lapel, and produces a tiny stick of beeswax to draw a mustache more dashing than biology can manage. Boots are heeled to click convincingly. Gloves are chosen for insolence. The illusion works from 20 rows back and from 2 feet away if the light behaves. Quirky tidbit leans out of a hat box. Some performers commission bespoke sock stuffers and chest pads from theatrical costumers who keep the paperwork vague and the fittings brisk. The parcels labeled haberdashery with the innocence of angels who can sew. The playfulness of the stage has cousins elsewhere. Masquerade balls, fancy dress nights at the pleasure gardens, and private parties in rented rooms invite wardrobes to lose their passports for an evening. A policeman stands outside Cremorne, or the Holborn Casino, and pretends that a domino cloak is just fabric rather than a license. Inside, couples waltz while costumes slide across categories the way bows slide across strings. Some attend for laughter and invisibility. Some attend because dressing as they wish feels like oxygen. Historians still argue whether cross-dressing at these events should be read primarily as theatrical fun and carnival upending of rank, or as an expression of identity learning to breathe in public for the first time. The newspapers keep the ink ready for scandal. The illustrated police news draws silhouettes of striking lady, who turn out inconveniently for the magistrate to be gentlemen, and the captions twitch with both shock and delight. Reynolds and other lively sheets cheerfully print trials involving suspicious wardrobes. Joke 1 peeks from a column. If outrage truly disliked spectacle, it would stop buying front row seats. A hansom rattles to a halt near the Strand. 2 gloved hands emerge, delicate as dinner invitations. When Ernest Bolton and Frederick Park, known to friends as Stella and Fanny, are arrested in evening gowns in 1870 and tried the next year, the city learns how quickly clothing becomes evidence. The police collect dresses, wigs and letters, as if fabric and ink can testify by themselves. Surgeons prod for proof that the law is not sure it can define. The verdict fails to condemn them of the gravest charge. And yet their lives are torn open like careless parcels. The mainstream fact is that their trial creates a dossier of photographs and memoranda that reads like a wardrobe inventory crossed with a morality play. And it teaches fashionable London that silk can be a subpoena. Police files catalogue more costumes than a stage manager's room. Reports note corsets, hairpieces, rouge, boots with scandalous lacing, and rings that suggest promises made without witnesses. In some notes, curiosity looks suspiciously like enthusiasm. In other notes, prudence wins and the constable writes in shorthand that might as well say nothing. You stand in a reading room, pages turned with white gloves, and hear the paper creak with the weight of anxious handwriting. Historians still argue whether enforcement targeted gender variance itself or used clothing as a proxy for suspected sexual conduct, especially in districts where class anxieties tuned the ear sharper than law. On balconies and in private boxes, society plays along with its own jokes. Ladies attend as pages in satin breeches and get away with it because charity masquerades forgive almost anything if the guest list glitters. Gentlemen arrive as dames with fans big enough to shoo away gossip, at least until the morning papers decide the joke has a surname. Fancy dress catalogues flourish listing Highland lads, midshipmen and troubadours for heroines, along with milkmaids and sultanas for men who prefer comic curves to chiseled jawlines. A customer near Covent Garden keeps a ledger coded more cleverly than some banks, and your deposit is measured in discretion rather than coin. In the stalls you hear the sentences that keep evenings afloat. "That is a smart suit, miss. That is a smart frock, sir." The double compliments collide and turn into laughter. A waiter refills glasses and becomes a human curtain, shielding a conversation that does not want to be photographed by a quarrelsome memory. He also knows who to summon if a door needs to open onto a quieter staircase. He accepts tips that whisper rather than clink. The theatre itself trains the eye to see gender as choreography. The principal boy plants legs firmly, hands on hips, voice pitched bright, thigh boots gleaming like patent logic. The dame waddles and wisecracks, all bustle and bosom, a parody so exaggerated it loops back toward comfort. Audiences leave with cheeks aching from smiling and a pocket full of permission slips they will never show anyone. Joke 2 nods toward the footlights. If understanding were contagious, a single pantomime season would vaccinate half the city. Beyond the proscenium, private cross-dressing carries different stakes. Some tailors specialize quietly in fitted gowns for male clients who come by back doors and arrive at hours that confuse clocks. They measure without comment, cut with excellence, and store patterns under false names. Milliners learn to keep veils long enough to shorten the walk from carriage to staircase. A few landlords, practical and unshocked, rent rooms with mirrors down to the floor and never ask why. In these small economies, dignity is a service and discretion a second rent. Scandal sheets reduce complexity to caricature because caricature sells. They link garments to crimes with a speed that would humiliate a tailor. Yet the same city that gobbles drawings of men in crinolines also spends good money on tickets. To see women in uniforms whipping out comic cigars and singing couplets about bachelor freedom. The contradiction is not a bug. It is the operating system. Your smile turns sideways when you realize that permission is granted by the program only when it can be returned at the door with the ticket stub. A quiet note: magistrates sometimes prefer to charge disorderly conduct or public indecency rather than wrestle openly with clothing. The charge sheet sidesteps the dress and attacks the scene. Juries, more at ease with noise than with nuance, nod. Fines fall like confetti. Lives reorganize. Some decide costuming will remain a private religion practiced only on pilgrimage nights. Others grow bolder because once you have seen yourself in a mirror and recognize the person waving back, it is hard to forget the route back to that reflection. The music hall curtain lowers. The chairman bows. The audience shuffles toward beer and cabs. You step into a lane washed with lamplight and perfume, hearing the lingering echo of a contralto making mock of bachelors, and of a dame who teased a colonel so deftly he thanked her for it afterward. Between stage and street runs a scene that thousands of hands stitch and restitch every night. Some wear the costume for applause, some for privacy, some for survival, and some because the body smiles only when the buttons are on the other side. Joke 3 tips its topper. If authenticity were sold by the yard, the queue at the customer's door would reach the river by morning. Instead, the city sells evenings, masks, and small mercies. You breathe, adjust your collar, and walk on, storing the sight of a cane-spinning gentleman who exits stage left and becomes lady tying her laces with the ease of someone who has decided which mirror is home. You follow the whisper of switches through a lane lined with shops that pretend to sell only umbrellas and walking sticks. In the window, a bundle of birch rods leans at a polite angle, their twigs tied with ribbon as if they were flowers for a stern bouquet. The card in neat copperplate reads, "Domestic Discipline Implements," which could mean many things, and in this neighborhood usually does. Inside, the proprietor offers varnished canes, braided catstraps, and a French martinet with tassels as glossy as a seal. His patter is soothing, almost clerical, as he praises resilience, balance, and the humane springiness of willow. The mainstream fact stands in the corner like a schoolmaster. Corporal punishment is ordinary in 19th century Britain, both in schools and in some homes, and that everyday grammar of birch and cane spills into a private marketplace where correction becomes theatre and pain performs as pleasure for those who ask it to. Upstairs, a tailor adjusts garments that are not for promenades. Tight bodices designed to restrain the arms. Skirts with discreet slits for the efficient application of moral philosophy. A gentleman orders a costume that might belong to a governess if governesses wore satin and carried rules in a lace pocket. A woman orders a jacket cut like a captain's, crisp with braid. The sort of coat that makes posture sit up straight. The mirror decides nothing. The wearer decides everything. You notice a drawer full of soft eye masks for customers who like the world to narrow to sound and touch. Quirky tidbit peeks out from the haberdashery. Some customers sell little packets of theatrical bruising powder in purplish tones. The same stage trick used by actors because illusion protects pride when customers want the look of severity without the souvenir. Across town, a private room displays its preferences with the delicacy of a tea tray. A birch soaks in a pale bath perfumed with lavender to keep the twigs supple. A cushion is placed just so, not for comfort but for aim. The host has rehearsed his apologies in case nerves arrive uninvited. The evening follows a script of rules as strict as any chaperoned courtship. Safe words are not yet a phrase here, but signals exist. A cough to slow a hand, a lifted shoe to ask for kinder tempo. The discipline of the scene is a kind of courtesy, and courtesy is this century's second religion. Joke 1 tips its hat. If politeness could be weighed, a single session in this room would tip the scale like a crate of silverware. The reading public develops an appetite to match the shop windows. Underground magazines pass from hand to hand. Stories of chastisement written in a tone that pretends to be improving and ends up being anything but. Private presses obligingly reprint older flagellatory classics with new titles and a varnish of moral purpose. Their language borrows schoolroom vocabulary the way a clever parody borrows a hymn tune. Historians still argue whether these texts reflect widespread practice or whether a small market with energetic printers made itself look vast by being busy and loud. What is certain is that plots built around birch and virtue sell faster than sermons about birch and virtue. Names that sit nicely in drawing rooms sometimes wander into rumor. A poet with sea spray in his metaphors acquires a reputation for enjoying the sting of switches, whether by fact or the fun that society has making myths from appetites. Clubs whisper. Bibliophiles collect thin volumes that rattle with quotations nobody will admit to owning. The traffic is brisk enough that a canny bookseller keeps a flagellation shelf behind a locked door labeled "Translations," which is both a lie and a little bit true. The shelf claims to be Greek and Latin and occasionally arrives wearing a domino mask labeled French. Another set of fantasies travels with steamers and survey teams. The empire provides maps for the imagination that are also mirrors for the metropole. In toy theaters and cheap novels, harems float across pages like palaces made of cushions, and sultanas manage households with a flair that owes more to London gossip than to any real city of the Levant. Water pipes appear, ungans bow, and veils ripple on schedule. Travelers' tales return with sketches of courtyards and phrases that promise secrets in climates warmer than morals. Mainstream reality raises a finger. The real households of the Ottoman world are governed by rules and families like any other. But the British taste for oriental scenes paints desire onto architecture and calls it anthropology. A private library in a grand house holds a locked cabinet with a serious name. Kama Shastra Society appears on the title page of certain volumes printed in tiny runs for gentlemen who like to present curiosity as scholarship. The translation work is uneven. The commentary is sometimes diligent and sometimes lush, and the binding is always respectful enough that the butler can carry the parcel without blushing. Historians still argue whether these editions advanced cultural understanding or mainly furnished the empire with new props for old fantasies. The books add to an old English habit of turning elsewhere into an alibi for appetites, as if geography itself could endorse a wish. In a bathhouse frequented by connoisseurs, an attendant offers switches of leafy birch like bouquets for a spa day. Guests call it health. The strike of twigs is described as stimulating circulation. The argument is not entirely wrong. It is also not entirely about circulation. You are shown a Russian method and a Swedish one, and nobody asks whether the guest is traveling by map or story. Massage parlors borrow techniques from everywhere and advertise them in language that pretends to be pure physiology. The body knows better, but the body is too polite to contradict a billhead that says therapy in an unblushing font. There are rooms that invert the centuries' hierarchies with an efficiency no speech could manage. A clerk with perfect penmanship kneels and calls a seamstress madam because the evening has requested this grammar. A colonel removes his medals and receives orders from a woman who earns her living at a sewing machine by day and believes in punctuality at night. They agree on rules, limits, and a fee that keeps the roof warm. The exchange is not always tender, but it is rarely cruel when skill runs the scene. She can command a hand with a single syllable. He can finally put down a weight he carried through parades. Joke too adjusts its cuffs. If equality wanted a rehearsal room, this would be it. Complete with carpet beater and a clock that never argues. Shops lean into the craze with careful labels. Thistle teas advertised as purifying. Nettle lotions advertised as fortifying. A small rack sells birch oil with instructions that sound like weather reports. Apply lightly and avoid high winds. A chemist keeps a back shelf for cooling salves hawked as post-exertion bombs. Customers do not explain the exertion and the chemist does not ask. The attention to aftercare is not only kind, it is advertising. A happy client returns and recommends without names. Pain here is not a sloppy thing. It has a steward. It keeps accounts. Which side of the switch marks but does not cut? Which cane sings without splintering? How far a scene can travel before it trespasses into next week? People swap advice with the precision of botanists. A better birch comes from young shoots cut at the right moon and dried with care. A lesser rod breaks when it should flex and ruins the mood like a joke that forgot its punchline. Quirky tidbit rustles the ribbon. Certain suppliers wrap their best bundles with red thread so the customer can find the sweet rod in dim light. A practical touch that flirts with symbolism and earns repeat business. The same city that tutors appetite also polices it. Magistrates are more comfortable charging disorderly house than spelling out why the furniture looks the way it does. When raids happen, catalogues of implements are read aloud to snickers that sound dutiful rather than shocked. A judge murmurs about corrupting the public without clarifying which public was admitted by appointment only. The law is clearest when someone is harmed and least clear when the participants are consenting and better organized than their critics. Historians still argue whether the authorities looked away when fees were high and noise low, or whether sporadic crackdowns served as cautionary theater to keep the whole parade one step quieter. Your ear catches the soft commerce of story. A client requests a colonial scene complete with palm frond and imaginary veranda. Another orders a naval fantasy with ropes coiled as neatly as a bosun's temper. Costumers complain cheerfully that empire brings more laundry than enlightenment. The props are light, the hunger is heavy. Exoticism rents rooms because it allows a person to pretend that customs are different just long enough to trade shame for costume and call the evening educational. Joke 3 taps the globe on a librarian's desk. If travel cured desire, steamships would sail home empty. Lamp oil lowers. Shop shutters slide. The birch rods in the window look like trees that forgot to grow leaves. Upstairs, Atosha counts coins with the thoughtful air of a man who has fitted courage more times than he can remember. Somewhere a bundle of switches dries beside a stove, fragrant with resin and purpose. This corner of the city lives on bargains that see themselves clearly. You can step into pain that is choreographed, step into fantasies built from maps and stage tricks. Step back into the cool street with a face that says good evening and a heart that says something arranged itself. The night keeps its counsel. The ribbon on the birch glows the last color before dark. You step through a doorway painted the color of cream into a studio where light behaves like a trained animal. A skylight pours down a gentle river that flatters cheekbones, and velvet backdrops wait on rollers like stage curtains that learn to whisper. A photographer in a black coat adjusts a brass lens as large as a teacup saucer. He calls this room his theater of truth, although the props insist the truth wears corsets. On a side table sit cartes de visite, small portrait cards that travel in envelopes and pockets, each one a tame miracle. The mainstream fact poses itself neatly. By the 1860s and 1870s, cartes and cabinet cards are a craze across Britain, with studios multiplying and portraits traded like calling cards. And the same camera that captures babies in lace also records bodies that prefer lace to be suggested rather than present. You are guided onto a painted floor that looks like marble and is actually cleverly scuffed oil. A model studies herself in a speckled mirror, pins one curl to flirt with her ear, and sits on a chaise that pretends to be Paris. She has learned the discipline of stillness that long exposures demand. Shoulders relax, fingers soften, eyes turn into lamps. The photographer adjusts the posing stand behind her neck, unseen by the final print. A metal crutch that keeps the skull from wandering during a 30-count patience. He murmurs a countdown like prayer. Breath becomes architecture, and the shutter answers with a soft kiss of brass. When the image swims up later in the tray, the room goes quiet as a chapel. The negative wears its world backwards, silver turning dark and dark turning silver. The printer lays it against paper painted with chemistry that smells faintly of almonds and thunder. An image blooms like a secret in warm water. The result is modest by today's standards. A bodice loosened, a stocking revealed, a curve implied by shadow. Yet the power is new. A moment of private undressing can now be printed by the dozen, passed from hand to hand, tucked into cigar cases, hidden behind the false bottom of a desk drawer that once hid only cigars. Down the street, a different studio advertises studies in art. The sign is careful. It promises anatomy for students, classical drapery, tasteful compositions. Everyone speaks as if the word nude cannot be spelled without Latin. A curtain separates paying clients from a waiting room where the air smells of beeswax and bravado. The photographer keeps albums for browsing, each bound in leather and fastened with brass clasps that click like small sins. Some images pose women as Venuses, amphorae at the ready, eyes cast upward as if they have accidentally climbed into a myth. Others prefer the reality of stockings rolled to the knee and a smile that took one rehearsal. Historians still argue whether the bulk of these images are made for artists as reference, for private collectors as excitement, or for traveling salesmen who deal in curiosities that refuse to sit quietly once purchased. A peddler opens his valise at a railway hotel and reveals a portable universe. Inside, rows of pocket albums bound in imitation tortoiseshell, each holding a dozen carts. Landscapes, actresses with plumed hats, a few saints to confuse the customs of conscience, and tucked discreetly at the back, a set of French pictures posed against damask that London pretends not to own. The buyer flips past cathedrals to the page where a woman balances on a chair with one boot off. The expression on her face halfway between amusement and a dare. Quirky tidbit peeks from the hinge of the valise. Some traveling albums come with false fronts that can be switched in a blink. A decoy page of mountains or bishops in case a porter or an aunt leans over too soon. The camera does not remain loyal to studios. It learns to travel. Stereoscopic views arrive like twins with a secret handshake. Two nearly identical photographs that, through a viewer, conjure a pocket world in 3 dimensions. Parlors giggle at waterfalls and alpine passes, then grow silent at the astonishing depth of a lady's shawl sliding from her shoulder. The stereoscope feels scientific and therefore excuses many adventures. You lift the viewer and find yourself looking into a room where a corset hangs from a chair and a mirror reflects a photographer working in his shirt sleeves. Eyes narrowed, caught by his own machine. Joke 1 taps the wooden frame. If science knew how often curiosity borrowed its spectacles, it might start charging rent. The risk of being seen changes everything. A sketch can be denied, a rumor can be folded, a photograph has a sting. People learn caution that feels new for an old activity. Models choose poses with fans obscuring faces, or choose profiles that their mother will not recognize at market. Photographers sell retouching as a kind of mask, smoothing scars, thinning chins, erasing moles that a jealous cousin could name from across a room. Trade etiquette includes unwritten rules. Never sell a recognizable lady's portrait outside the agreed set. Never let the printer keep extra negatives after payment. Never store plates near windows because sunlight has a temper. Printers whisper about police visits. Officials with warrants lift albums that sailed too near the edge of taste, and studios learn to keep the more daring negatives elsewhere, perhaps in a trunk labeled Latin grammar. Sometimes the law wants to make a statement simply by being seen. At other times it gathers proofs for court, and a judge must pretend to read images as if they were paragraphs, while the jury pretends to be shocked at classical drapery that forgot to bring the drapery. Historians still argue whether prosecutions alter the overall supply or merely raise prices and move the trade to back stairs where doorbells work better. You wander to a photographer who specializes in actresses and the gentlemen who admire them. He builds illusions with the concentration of an engineer. A velvet curtain here to suggest a drawing room. A painted balustrade there to insist that everyone is standing on a balcony where the moon is punctual. His most popular line is a stage tableau of reading in bed, an activity that appears somehow wholesome and scandalous in the same breath. The actresses pose with novels that critics call improper when the cover is turned outward and improving when the cover faces inward. The ambiguity sells. Joke too flips a page. If hypocrisy were an emulsion, it would fix faster than silver. In a workroom, a young woman sorts negatives, holding each plate by its varnished edge. She is an assistant by day and a sitter by agreement. Her pay includes cash and 3 prints for her own keeping. She sends one to a sweetheart in the South African light, another to a friend who understands what the picture says without words, and hides the third between floorboards under her bed, where she can visit herself on mornings when courage needs a reminder. She is not a fallen anything. She is a worker who has discovered that her image can buy food, and that the transaction, while risky, tastes like choice. Postcards arrive late in the century and soon fan across tables in cheap hotels and quiet bedrooms. Some are innocuous, the fade of a pier, the smudge of a seaside donkey. Others are sepia whispers that travel from Paris with postmarks that interest customs officials more than mothers. A collector mounts them in albums that look like hymnals and flips the pages like a priest rushing a cloudy day. Quirky habit hums under the lamplight. A few hobbyists trim the edges to fit into cigarette boxes for easy concealment. The cards pressed between tobacco-scented paper, so desire always smells faintly of smoke. The camera alters memory. Couples who once relied on pressed flowers and ticket stubs now add a likeness, a risk folded into a souvenir. Lovers sit for double portraits that pretend to be studio friendships. Some hold hands just out of frame, the gesture as warm as a secret and as invisible as good manners require. Others exchange images in envelopes lined with jokes about art, a private language written in paper and silver. The print under the pillow becomes a talisman, helpful when winter is long and the rent is a poor conversationalist. A final visit takes you to a back lane where a photographer uses daylight only and refuses theatrical props. His models are ordinary women and men who want to be remembered for the curve of a shoulder and a look that belongs to Tuesday afternoon rather than Olympus. He works fast, charges fair prices, and keeps no albums for display. He believes that bodies are better at dignity than sermons allow. Some images are kept in drawers for a lifetime. Some burn in hearths before weddings. The decision belongs to the people in the pictures, which is as radical as any new lens. Night gathers at the skylight, and the studio smells of hypo and ambition. The last print dries on a rack that looks like a miniature fence. The photographer hangs his black cloth like a folded storm cloud and sets the lens cap down with the care of a bookmark. You leave with the memory of a face that stared calmly into glass and became paper, then became secret, then became something that could be carried under a waistcoat close enough to learn a heartbeat. Joke 3 nods from the doorstep. If honesty sold tickets, every darkroom would have a queue around the block. Instead, it has a bell that rings softly, and you stepping out with your collar up, holding a pocket that feels heavier than the coin you paid. You board a steamer where the deck smells of tar, oranges, and ambition, and you feel the tug of a project that insists salvation can be shipped in crates. Missionaries read their Bibles with one eye and shipping lists with the other. Harmoniums travel alongside barrels of tracts, sewing needles, school primers, and a collapsible pulpit that looks suspiciously like a well-bred suitcase. When the ship makes port, a small congregation appears as if conjured, teachers with slates, a doctor with a leather bag, a printer who can turn a proverb into a pamphlet before supper. The empire becomes a map for morals drawn with ink, telegraphs, and very sturdy boots. A veranda classroom fills with bright air. Children sound out alphabets in 2 languages. Mothers come for medicines and stay for talk. A pastor tunes his harmonium as if it were a compass. The mainstream fact walks in calmly and takes a seat. British missionary societies multiply through the 19th century, from the London Missionary Society to the Church Missionary Society and beyond, establishing schools, clinics and churches across Asia, Africa and the Pacific, while sending back letters that shape opinion at home. Those letters crowd Victorian newspapers and parlours with tales of idols toppled, schools opened and evils battled. The word civilizing travels on these pages as if it had never met an adverb it did not like. The dilemmas begin at once and do not stop for tea. A convert with 2 wives asks which door leads to baptism. A chief asks whether his authority survives if young men prefer chapel to initiation rites. A judge wonders how to register marriages that do not resemble the version his law book understands. Historians still argue whether missionary work primarily dismantled local traditions to fit metropolitan expectations or whether in certain places it offered a framework that shielded converts from the rougher edges of colonial markets and magistrates. Your ears collect examples that tug both directions and your pockets feel heavier with the weight of unintended consequences. In an Indian cantonment, bugles mark the hours and the sun burns decision into the dust. The authorities decide that soldierly health is strategy and build institutions to suit the plan. Lock hospitals sit at the edge of the parade ground and brothels are licensed along a geometry only a quartermaster could love. A cantonment act regulates women as if they are spare parts for the machine of empire, inspected and detained, while the men they serve march past inspection far more easily. Reformers write home in sharp ink. Some demand stricter control. Some demand abolition, and the rest demand evidence assembled without euphemism. Joke 1 wipes its brow. If policy could be cooled by shade, the entire subcontinent would require awnings the size of counties. A Zenana mission visits women in seclusion, carrying needles, picture cards, and the efficient gossip of a health visitor. The classroom is a courtyard. Lessons include letters and baby care, scripture and vaccination. A doctor learns to listen through a veil and discovers that a cough sounds like a cough in any language. At the same time, a pamphlet arrives about child marriage and widowhood, and a legislative debate blooms. In 1891, the age of consent in India is raised by statute, a point of law that looks tidy on paper and untidy in lives. Some families welcome the change. Others resent distant men writing rules for roofs they have never seen. Missionaries are pooled between advocacy and prudence, knowing that a victory without neighbors will feel strangely hollow at dusk. In China, a meeting hall bristles with banners that promise new feet for a new century. The anti-foot-binding movement gathers local reformers and missionaries who carry pledge forms. Lecture slides and a model shoe that looks like a joke and is not. Elsewhere in the same city, an opium den glows like a painted lantern, and missionary editors hammer essays against a trade many at home prefer not to notice, because prophets have a polite accent. The contradictions pile up like crates on a quay. Commerce sails faster than conscience. Conscience keeps writing until the ink begins to stain ledgers. You tuck away a detail that tastes like hope. Boycotts are unfashionable words, but subscriptions to anti-opium campaigns grow fat enough to make a chancellor frown. A chapel in southern Africa fills with hymn tunes learned in both directions. The preacher's wife teaches needlework and arithmetic. The congregation teaches her to clap on the beat. A village elder speaks about cattle, rain, and the problem of promises made by strangers who travel with commissioners. Polygamy presents its usual theological riddle. Some couples choose monogamy for baptism, some do not, and pastoral letters grow creative in their footnotes. Historians still argue whether conversion produced new domestic possibilities for women and children, or whether it simply rewrapped older patriarchies in imported cloth. The argument gets interrupted by supper, which is always how theology meets the body. The mail steamer carries home more than hallelujah. It carries panic, praise, and produce from the rumor mill. Reports of a white man living as a local spouse arrive with the shock of a dropped plate. Reports of a magistrate keeping a concubine prompt editorials that preach the decorum of segregation while ignoring the history of mixed households that cities have been making since ships learned the way south. A governor issues a circular about respectability that mostly looks like a wish. Society in the settlement tends to be small and secrets breed faster than mosquitoes. Joke 2 adjusts its hat. If hypocrisy paid customs duty, colonial treasuries would overflow. A darker corridor leads you to a barracks medical store where bottles line up like soldiers. Venereal charts hang on a wall. Inspectors file numbers with military neatness. The picture is both public health and racial arithmetic, and too often the arithmetic decides who is examined and who is blamed. Pieties about purity become policies that map onto color, and the consequences travel home by telegraph disguised as statistics. A few doctors say this is medicine. A few missionaries say this is sin wearing a stethoscope. Most officials say very little because silence travels better than awkward sentences. Elsewhere, a printing press clatters. A missionary printer sets type in 2 scripts and runs off primers that allow a child to spell Jesus and jackfruit in the same lesson. He also prints a newsletter about temperance, complete with a woodcut of a bottle with a serpent for a neck. The same village has a tavern where policemen sing on Saturdays. The temperance hall argues that sobriety is modernity and modernity is progress. The tavern argues that work without song is a poor bargain. The argument is not settled by sermons. It is settled by wages and whether the well is close enough to make water less trouble than beer. A magic lantern show unfolds on a wall after dusk. Slides click from Bethlehem to Birmingham to Bombay and children gasp when the light conjures a picture of the very school where they sit. A collector in England passes a plate and coins ring like little amens. Quirky tidbit waves from a wooden crate backstage. Some lanternists travel with a portable thunder machine and a box of smelling salts to enliven sober lectures on vice and virtue, proving that even morality likes a bit of stagecraft when the audience fidgets. Political storms arrive as predictably as monsoon. A missionary gets caught between a protest against taxes and a police baton. Another mediates after a riot sparked by a rumor that nobody can later remember exactly. He writes to London asking for calm, then writes to his mother asking for socks. The imperial administration tolerates missionaries when their schools produce clerks and interpreters, bristles when their editorials shame the revenue, then borrows their hospital when fever arrives in uniform. Historians still argue whether missions served as handmaids to empire or as the most persistent critics it accidentally paid to travel. A woman physician in Osam wraps a bandage, while a grandmother explains that pain must be addressed but foreignness should not be inhaled whole. The doctor nods and teaches with gentleness, born of 1,000 house calls. She keeps a ledger where births and fevers share a page with small triumphs. A new midwife trained. A husband who agrees that childbirth is not an exam of virtue. A spoonful of cod liver oil swallowed without theatrics. Small notes travel farther than sermons because they fit inside a pocket without wrinkling. At the quay, the steamer whistles. Crates marked with Mission Society initials are winched aboard. A boy carries a cage of doves for a wedding. A clerk carries a locked tin box full of receipts for souls and shingles alike. You look back toward the town where chapel steeple and courthouse flagpole point at the same sky and disagree about everything else. Joke 3 tucks a tract into your pocket. If goodness could be audited, half the world would be asking for an extension. Night folds itself around the mission bungalow. A lamp glows on a veranda where a catechist rehearses lessons. A nurse counts bandages. And a traveler writes a letter that will arrive in a month as news from the past. Empire declares itself a highway for progress. The people who walk it discover it is also a maze, and the surest way through is courtesy, curiosity, and a refusal to let policy speak louder than faces. You close the gate quietly and listen to crickets argue their own theology. Unbothered by borders, unimpressed by maps. You turn into a market street where hawkers sing prices and the penny press snaps its inky jaws. Between tonic waters and hair restorers, small advertisements blink like fireflies. They promise relief for irregularities, restoration of the female system, the certain reappearance of the monthly visitor. The language is gentle and resolute at once. A chorus that says everything without saying the forbidden word. A grocer folds your newspaper, careful not to reveal the column until your coin is safe. A girl with red hands buys pennyroyal from a herb store with a face that pretends to be shopping for gravy. A bell above a chemist's door gives a discreet click. You browse the front shelves where cough mixtures salute with labels, then drift to drawers that require a different kind of conversation. The clerk keeps his voice in a low register and his answers in conditional moods. Perhaps a lady has found her courses delayed by cold or by exertion. Perhaps she would consider a warming draught, a sitz bath, a few drops of tincture. The bottle he wraps is labelled for feminine obstruction, not for ending pregnancies, because ink can be prosecuted and glass cannot be cross-examined. Mainstream fact unrolls itself calmly. Under the Offences Against the Person Act of 1861, using poison or instruments to procure a miscarriage is a felony with severe penalties, and selling or supplying means to that end is criminal too, which pushes the whole business into code and corners, but does not erase the demand that keeps drawers stocked. Euphemism is a talent here. Female pills flood the classified pages at the price of a loaf. Parisian remedy for suppression. French regulators for married ladies. Silver pills to restore nature. Quirky tidbit winks from a compositor's tray. Printers sometimes set these notices in smaller type to dodge complaints, but they also place them beside ads for baby clothes with a deadpan that would make a saint shrug. The neighbors read everything. Mothers clip recipes from housekeeping columns and keep them in prayer books where the edges soften with handling. You take a lane to a cottage where the sign says, "Monthly Nurse," and the door says, "Come quickly." Inside the fire has a practical blaze. A kettle simmers. Smells of rue and tansy climb the air with stubborn botanical cheerfulness. The woman who greets you has the hands of someone who has caught more babies than she has counted years. She knows every method that keeps secrets. Foot baths so hot they make ankles think again. Teas of pennyroyal, savin and steel filings in vinegar that taste like bad decisions and sometimes are. A measured dose of ergot to cramp a womb into obedience if the timing is within the window, where the body can be persuaded that a late period is only late. Historians still argue whether such household remedies worked often enough to tilt statistics or merely gave frightened women a feeling of action while biology flipped its own coin. The ledger of results is written in quiet memory, not ledgers. The midwife lays out a neat cloth, needles, thread, a curved instrument with a name that nobody speaks tonight. Her talk is slow, not to frighten but to prevent haste. She says she is a monthly nurse, not a surgeon. She says the safest cure is the one that brings the menses without instruments. The risk in her voice is a weather report. She will pour tea and see if the body listens. She will feel the pulse, count days, and consult the calendar that hangs from a nail beside the clock. She knows she may be called angel by one family and criminal by another across the lane on the same evening. Hospitals present a different face. Lying in wards smell of carbolic, cabbage and endurance. Students in black coats stand at a polite distance and try to look invisible. Doctors publish statistics about puerperal fever and antiseptic wash. Nurses keep notes that no one prints. A girl with a grey shawl slips in by the side entrance and asks to see a house surgeon. Her breath is quick, her eyes are set. The surgeon chooses phrases that promise nothing and kindness that promises everything. He arranges a bed and a watch, orders a purge and keeps his conscience pointed at symptoms instead of causes. Joke one warms its hands at the stove. If discretion were a prescription, the hospital would dose the entire district twice a day with meals. The city grows a parallel industry of specialists who call themselves women's friends and prefer cash in advance. Their rooms are clean and their risks are high. Some are competent and careful. Some are cynical and fast. All work behind doors that listen hard. A landlady holds coats and never remembers faces. She is paid to keep time and to keep watch. A bottle of laudanum sits on a shelf as calm as a cat. When things go wrong, the room reorganizes itself into innocence with a speed that would impress the theatre. The patient staggers home or to a hostile. The specialist burns rags and stirs the fire as if supper is late. The law can knock. It cannot rewind. Coroner's courts seat the saddest audiences in the city. A juryman's pencil hovers while a doctor describes lesions in a voice designed to sound like the weather. The phrase caused by some instrument appears with a regularity that turns breath thin. A mother weeps and the room pretends not to notice because noticing would dissolve the benches. The press prints a column where the adverbs work overtime. The verdict is misadventure or murder, depending on the angle of a question answered badly. Historians still argue whether such proceedings served more to warn or to terrify, and whether terror ever reduced need in households where rent and bread do the arithmetic. Lawyers bring tidy Latin to messy kitchens. They cite the 1861 statute and remind juries that quickening no longer divides crimes into separate boxes, that intent outranks timing. They also cite related measures that make information itself precarious. Obscenity prosecutions do not spare pamphlets that discuss methods too clearly. Chemists learn to smile and sell something labeled for skin complaints when a customer's eyes hold the question that words cannot risk. Some magistrates are harsh. Others choose fines when they suspect a woman sought safety rather than sin. The inconsistency is its own kind of sentence. You pass a barrow in the market stacked with almanacs. They list moon phases, planting times, and cures for female obstruction that have migrated from herb wives into calendars. A farmer's wife swears by tansy tea and a long walk. A seamstress swears by castor oil and a hot brick at the feet. A soldier's sweetheart swears by nothing because swearing is for people with choices. Quirky habit taps the spine of an almanac. Some readers draw a tiny cross beside a recipe that seemed to help, then tear out the page before Lent to avoid questions at confession or over laundry. Inside a newspaper office, a compositor sets the next column of classified ads with a speed that comes from practice and a face that comes from learning to notice nothing. The editor slashes one advertisement that says too much and leaves another that says too little, which means it will sell better. A letter arrives from a moral society promising to sue anyone who prints recipes that lead to crime. Another arrives from a physician arguing that plain facts about reproduction would save more lives than sermons ever have. Historians still argue whether the years saw a drift from home methods toward barrier devices and abstinence cycles, or whether all of it braided together into the quiet decline of birth rates in families that could no longer afford to be surprised every spring. A friend shows you a shop where penny packets of steel and aloes sit next to soothing syrups. The proprietor learned his trade from a military hospital where pain met pragmatism. He insists on small doses and larger warnings. He knows the line between bringing on a late period and starting a hemorrhage that will wreck a room and a life. He sells a little hope and a little fear in equal measures. Joke 2 peers into the till. If caution paid interest, the chemist would never need to post a sale sign again. The culture invents nicknames to survive its own anxieties. Monthly nurse becomes angel. Handywoman becomes aunt. Obstructed becomes unwell. Police reports use the word instrument as if a violin were to blame. Midwives use words like tidying and restoring because plain talk invites grief. The vocabulary is a quilt of kindness sewn over holes in the law. Every thread aims to keep someone warm tonight. You finish by a riverside and let the water count its own seconds. Somewhere a pot boils over on a cottage stove while a woman stares at the door and prays that footsteps will mean help rather than questions. Somewhere a doctor calculates how to save a life without losing his license. Somewhere a printer sets the phrase for married ladies only and wonders who will read it with shaking hands. Joke 3 leans on the rail. If Mercy had an address, most of the city would already know the route. Until then, it borrows kitchens and back rooms, sits down at scrub tables, and does what it can with rue, calendars, and courage. You find yourself in a study where everything smells faintly of dust, printer's ink, and certainty. Books line the walls with spines that announce themselves like magistrates. On the desk lies a stack of letters written in patient, cramped hands, each one a confession disguised as a case history. You run your fingers along a paper knife and realize this room believes that if it can name something, it can understand it. Tonight belongs to the new habit of giving desire a Latin label, pinning it like a butterfly, and arguing about whether it is a beautiful specimen or a moth that eats curtains. A physician in a dark coat opens a volume whose title glints like a verdict. Psychopathia sexualis sits there with the confidence of a steam engine. The mainstream fact is unambiguous. In the late 19th century, medical men compile encyclopedias of erotic behavior. Most famously, Richard von Kraftebing, who popularizes categories such as sadism and masochism, borrowing names from literature to christen habits that had been telling their own stories for centuries. The doctor reads a case in which a gentleman cannot be content unless silk is involved, another in which a lady faints at the sight of red uniforms and calls it love, and a third where the patient prefers punishment to flowers. The tone is clinical. The effect on readers is never purely clinical. Across the channel, a quieter English voice sharpens a pencil. Havelock Ellis manuscripts and circulates questionnaires. Convinced that ordinary experience deserves an index card as much as scandal does. The book on his table is about sexual inversion. A phrase that sounds like geometry and means same-sex love, presented as congenital for many, acquired for some, and neither a crime nor a simple illness. He collects testimonials that speak about first crushes at school and the relief of finding language for a wordless weather. He coins terms like autoerotism for solitary desire, trying to move the conversation from sin and panic to observation and patterns. Historians still argue whether these casebooks humanize their subjects by letting them speak or trap them by translating lives into files. A drawer produces an earlier lexicon from continental pamphlets. Words like Uranian and Erning from Karl Heinrich Ulrichs share the stage with a new pair introduced by a Hungarian writer who prefers pseudonyms. Homosexual and heterosexual enter the vocabulary of the 1860s in private, then climb onto English pages by the 1890s and pretend they have been there all along. Language has learned an efficient trick. Two fresh labels turn a crowd into measurable columns. Joke 1 lifts an eyebrow. If naming a thing solved a thing, dictionaries would replace hospitals. The method here is a blend of notebooks and nerves. Doctors assemble case histories in a voice that prefers regular verbs, then insert reflections that reveal how much the material has unsettled them. A clergyman writes 3 pages about the panic that follows a dream and adds a polite postscript asking to be anonymous forever. A teacher contributes an essay on tender friendships and the temple of art. A seamstress writes about disgust at early experiences and later relief with a gentle husband. Quirky tidbit knocks from a pigeonhole. Some researchers keep color-coded index cards for categories of arousal. A filing system neat enough to make librarians blush and patients feel like library books. Another shelf displays treatises that measure skulls, skeletons, and soot. Anthropometry puts calipers to cheekbones, as if passion lives in bone. Phrenology lingers as a parlor game turned dubious science, offering bumps and maps that promise predictions better than horoscopes. In lecture halls, serious physiologists scoff and promise better instruments soon. They test reflexes, pupils, and pulses while reading poetry aloud to see who blushes. The performance is impressive, if not always replicable, and the apparatus makes everyone look industrious and modern. Historians still argue whether these physical tests capture anything useful about the private storm, or merely prove that bodies do all sorts of things when strangers in frock coats are taking notes. A legal book perches on the window ledge like a crow. The law's keywords do not care for nuance. It demands categories that produce charges. Scholars of sex write categories that produce footnotes. Between crow and footnote lives the police report, a genre that loves adjectives when it should love accuracy. Doctors point out that punishment alters nothing and shame makes medicine harder. Magistrates reply that public order requires simple lines, not diagrams. The public buys newspapers that contain both voices and then turns to the advertisements to buy something for nerves anyway. You take a seat and read longer. Havelock Ellis keeps returning to variability, to the idea that human desire behaves like weather rather than a railway timetable. He quotes correspondents who describe themselves as exclusively drawn to their own sex, others who drift across the aisle without drama, still others who find contentment only when a partner wears a particular fabric or speaks in a particular register. He tells stories of marriages that succeed with friendship and agreement, of friendships that quietly outlast law and scandal, and of loneliness disguised as caution. He is criticized for too much sympathy and not enough fire. He replies that science can be warm without becoming woolly. In another city, a lecture proposes degeneration theory with the solemnity of a funeral. Civilization, the speaker warns, will drown in its own luxuries unless medical men raise barricades. The argument moves like a parade and steps neatly over exceptions. It explains everything and therefore explains little. Students take notes they will forget after tea. Joke 2 smooths a cuff. If doom could be prevented by adjectives alone, we would all be saved by Tuesday. Meanwhile, the letters keep arriving. A widow writes that conjugal life was always sorrow and that she feels cured by solitude. A factory foreman writes that he cannot pass a boot shop without stopping and that he now avoids certain streets simply to get home before midnight. A schoolmistress writes that she finds women's company a cathedral and men's company a corridor with drafts. A soldier writes that he has lived in barracks and deserts and that the only constant has been a preference that chose him rather than the other way around. The physician files each note, then wonders privately how many other letters were burned because postage costs courage and courage was busy. The room has a global map with pins that pretend to prove something. Reports come from Berlin salons, from Capri's rented villas, from Parisian cafes where poets drink chocolate at odd hours, from Bloomsbury boarding houses where teapots keep secrets. The pins crowd certain districts and leave others blank, which probably means more about the postal system and languages of confidence than about desire itself. Historians still argue whether these networks constitute a movement or a series of polite conspiracies. The only consensus is that correspondence becomes a lifeline when the street threatens to turn into a courtroom. You notice a slim folder labeled with euphemisms. It contains essays on love between women that doctors struggle to see because society trains them to be blind. Some deny the possibility entirely. Others insist it must be chaste, ethereal, or tragic. A few, finally listening to the letters, admit that tenderness, invention, and pleasure are available to any two people stubborn enough to find them. A novelist cloaks such bonds in lilies and attic windows. A pamphleteer strips the lilies and becomes unprintable. Between them lies a long conversation held in parlors where the door latch is trusted and the coal scuttle is full. The debate that refuses to end sits at the edge of the blotter. Is desire a congenital temperament, a variation like left-handedness, or a wound from upbringing, vice, and unfortunate literature? The answers change tone depending on who is talking and whether he had lunch. Some doctors bend toward tolerance by arguing for nature. Others bend toward tolerance by arguing for harmlessness. Whatever the origin, a smaller, louder school argues for cure and proposes hydrotherapy, hypnosis, marriage, or travel, as if a suitcase could replace a soul. Joke 3 taps the inkwell. If relocation healed hearts, every railway company would advertise moral timetables. Even in the most earnest pages, there are small mercies. A doctor writes with unusual decency about shame and its cost, admitting that many who write to him seek permission to be honest rather than permission to sin. Another admits that his patients taught him more than his professors. A third confesses uncertainty and therefore becomes more trustworthy. The mood is changing by inches. It will change further, for now the study door closes softly. The papers return to their folders. The lamp is turned down, and names sleep in alphabetical order, while the people they describe step into streets where vocabulary can either soften a night or sharpen it. You drift into a street where nursery windows glow like tiny aquariums and shopkeepers stack prams in a proud line along the curb. The word perambulator is so long it feels like a polite stroll by itself. Inside those windows you spot cots with lace canopies, rattles made of bone and silver, feeding bottles shaped like commas lying down for a nap. A mother counts pennies with one hand and stitches with the other, and a father stands in the doorway doing a kind of arithmetic that begins with wages and ends with silence. The century loves babies in paintings and poems. It also loves ledgers. Tonight the two negotiate. A registrar copies numbers with monkish patience. Births, deaths, marriages, all inked into national memory. The mainstream fact waves from the margin in tidy figures. In the later 19th century, the British birth rate begins to decline, noticeable by the 1870s and more obvious by the 1890s. A slide that statisticians can trace in reports and censuses. While newspapers invent headlines such as the birth strike, the reasons do not wear labels on their lapels. They travel in pairs and in crowds. Wages rise for some, rents rise for more. Cities fill, floors creak under cribs, and the price of coal, shoes, and lamp oil follows families up staircases like a persistent salesman. You step into a schoolroom bright with chalk dust where children in rows recite a lesson about rivers. A slate clacks, a bell rings. The Elementary Education Act of 1870 opens the door wider to schooling, and later measures make attendance compulsory and often free. Historians still argue whether the school law becomes a birth control lesson in disguise. The claim is simple. When a future requires school boots, copybooks, and the kind of quiet that costs space, families choose to have fewer children, so the ones they do have can keep up. The counter-argument says that families who value education also tend to value planning, and the planning would have arrived even without statutes. The debate slips a note into the satchel and walks home for tea. On a kitchen table you find a budget penciled and stubborn. Bread, coal, meat on Sunday, rent, boots, milk, kerosene, club dues for the burial society, 2 modest outings at the music hall if no one is ill. A child knocks the pencil and laughs. The family laughs too and moves 1 coin from sweets to socks. Joke 1 smiles at the ledger. If arithmetic could babysit, parents would have an evening off every week. The truth is plainer. What used to be absorbed by older siblings and a grandmother in the back room now feels like an invoice. Urban rooms are smaller. Grandmothers often live 2 train stops away. Every extra child fits less neatly than sentiment pretends. The doctor's bag grows lighter with certain tools and heavier with new convictions. Vaccination campaigns reduce smallpox deaths. Sanitary improvements harden the city against cholera and typhoid. Pure water creeps into pipes. Sewers learn to mind their business. Infant life protection laws nibble at the scandals that haunt newspapers. And midwifery reforms slowly polish standards. Parents notice the difference in the blue stain measure. The baby who once had a coin tosser's chance now has better odds. Fewer funerals in tiny coffins means parents can choose fewer births without the ache of constant insurance by numbers. That is not cold. It is humane. A less dangerous childhood invites intention to take the front seat. You stop at a draper's where christening gowns hang beside mourning bands with an honesty that suggests both are regular stock. A woman orders a gown and, lowering her voice, asks whether the chemist next door sells the sensible items discussed in whispers at the sewing circle. He does. She knows how to use them because her cousin taught her, and because a certain pamphlet, kept folded behind the flour tin, has a paragraph marked with a pinprick. Methods now share a house with motives. Condoms, sponges, syringes, abstinence calendars. A talent for going to bed earlier but not at the same time. Families pick from the basket according to temperament, purse and nerves. Quirky tidbit lifts a curtain cord. Some nurseries keep Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup on the shelf for fretful nights. A sweet mixture that famously contains opiates, which calms babies and terrifies modern readers in the same sentence. A mill town hums beyond the schoolyard, and a factory whistle becomes a metronome for lives. Women's wages matter not just as pin money, but as rent money. A mother with a loom or a ledger is not a scandal in a district where work follows need. Marital decisions adjust to shifts. A couple postpones marriage until they can afford a room without a shared stair. Another marries and delays a first child until the apprentice pay rate matures. Respectability learns to include prudence along with piety. Joke 2 nods toward the clock. If delays could be baptized, half the parish register would read "christened by savings." In respectable newspapers, commentators sharpen quills about the national future. Some fret that the race will weaken if prudent families reproduce less, while careless families reproduce without counting. Others claim that a smaller family with better health and better schooling is exactly the patriotic choice. Less weight on poor relief, more polish on future clerks and mechanics. The statesman drops a sentence about quality over quantity and receives letters from both sides accusing him of blasphemy or common sense. The pew whispers, the pub argues, the cradle sleeps through the commotion. Inside a toy shop, you find a miniature blackboard and a set of building blocks with letters printed cleanly on their sides. The price is not trivial. The clerk explains that enlightened households invest in play with purpose. He says this while making change for a mother who looks as if she has already done the sum and decided that 2 children can have quality, while 4 would turn the parlor into arithmetic without windows. The shop offers layaway for prams and for fancy cradles that rock with reassuring confidence. People buy the pram and borrow the cradle from a cousin, then call it tradition. The registrar's numbers do not tell you what happens behind doors, but you can hear some of it in stairwells. Couples talk about bodies without blushing as much as their parents did. They call it health or rest or spacing and then get on with the washing up. Some rely on devices. Some rely on the oldest method in the world and take their chances. Some learn to read calendars with a devotion previous generations reserved for almanacs and moon phases. Historians still argue whether knowledge spreads chiefly through print and pamphlets after public trials and debates, or whether the heart of the change is the quiet apprenticeship of cousins, neighbors, and midwives passing skill by whisper and by example. A midwife counts little shirts. She keeps a separate shelf for the gifts she gives to families who decide 2 are enough. A ribbon here, a sturdy pin, a charm stitched with initials. She says she likes to mark a decision the way you mark a birthday. The father pretends not to wipe his eyes. The mother does not pretend. They both know the cost of gruel, the price of coal when winter sulks, the sound their own bones make when laundry meets stairs. They also know the taste of hopes that require attention, a violin lesson, a second-hand microscope, a pair of boots that do not blister. The nursery itself changes costume. Walls carry alphabets rather than hunting prints. Books about animals and explorers join prayer books on the shelf. A small globe spins under curious fingers. The room signals that childhood is a project, not a season to be endured until the child is tall enough to fetch coal. A notice over the mantel reminds everyone to shut the window against drafts. Another reminds the nurse to boil the feeding bottle, a shape nicknamed the murder bottle when cleaning is neglected. That phrase keeps terror as a servant, useful enough to save lives. At the edge of the park, prams queue like ships at anchor while mothers share news. 2 say they are finished. One says not yet and smiles as if weather is involved. No one is shocked. The city has learned to accept that virtue wears arithmetic now. A matron from an older street shakes her head and says the country will run out of choir boys. A friend pats her hand and says choirs sound better when children are not coughing through the hymns. Joke 3 waves at the bandstand. If harmony depended on the number of altos in a single parish, conductors would be census clerks. As evening gathers, a clerk at the registrar's office caps his ink and stretches his fingers. The ledger for births is thick enough to satisfy a sentimental poem and thin enough to satisfy a realist's purse. The death ledger is thinner than it used to be, and that may be the kindest statistic on the shelf. You leave the nursery windows to their glow, pass a pram that creaks like a ship dreaming of the sea, and picture a family counting quietly in a room where shoes dry by the hearth. Fewer pairs, perhaps, but each one a size that fits a path that leads somewhere worth the walk. You cross a square where statues balance pigeons and opinion in equal measure, and the city around you speaks with an accent it learned in parlors and courts a century ago. Words about decency still clear throats. Words about freedom still rattle teacups. You walk past a courthouse that looks like a temple of common sense, and hear arguments that feel familiar even when the dates change. Tonight belongs to the afterlife of a mood. The way a habit of mind survives in laws, in gossip, in the soft rule book most people follow without reading. A bookseller arranges paperbacks in a window and avoids the old traps with the ease of someone who grew up hearing about them. Censorship still exists, but it wears a modern jacket. The mainstream fact tips its hat. In 1959, Parliament passes a new Obscene Publications Act that allows works to defend themselves on grounds of literary or artistic merit. A reform that alters prosecutions and makes judges read instead of simply frown. Later decades turned trials into seminars. A jury can now acquit a book by calling it serious, which is either a triumph for art or a clever costume for old curiosity. Joke one waves from the display. If merit wore a badge, half the reading public would become honorary inspectors. You pass a plain doorway with a plaque that quotes a report written in the chill of the post-war years. The Wolfenden Committee in 1957 recommends that private behavior between consenting adults be decriminalized, a sentence that takes 10 years to grow legs. In 1967, England and Wales changed the law, and the police received new instructions about where to look and where to leave people alone in peace. The language does not arrive in poetry, but it arrives. Something tight unclenches. People exhale who had forgotten how. Historians still argue whether law led culture or culture dragged law along by the sleeve while pretending to ask permission. Language remembers its old tricks. Euphemism still sells. Health products still promise discretion and better sleep without naming the reasons sleep is scarce. The difference is that most chemists can now speak plainly and keep their license. An aisle that once hid behind the word hygiene now calls itself family planning and stocks methods that would have made a Victorian chemist polish the counter for courage. Quirky tidbit peeks from a shelf. Some modern shops still wrap certain items in a little extra paper as a nod to custom. The way bakers slip an extra sheet between sticky buns so the bag does not tell tales. Museums curate what the century tried to hide. In a gallery you find a case of fans, bodices and pamphlets that once traveled in brown paper with guilty glue. A placard speaks briskly about the 1857 crackdown, the later Hickland test, and the slow relaxation that followed. Visitors lean in and read the labels in silence that feels like respect and a little mischief. You step aside for a school group that writes notes with intense faces. They will write essays about control and pleasure, and then they will laugh gently on the bus because bus seats turn every serious topic into a comedy within 6 stops. Bedrooms keep evolving while the law tries to write labels for them. Some couples prefer doorbells that ring for 3 people rather than 2. Some find that names like husband and wife feel comfortable exactly as they are. Others try on new words that fit better. Courts argue about consent with more clarity than their grandparents did, and juries learn that silence is not a signature. The idea that privacy belongs to everyone, not as a favor but as a right, grows roots. It still needs watering. It always will. The public square performs morality with bright lights and scheduled applause. A politician announces a clampdown on something that feels untidy and the crowd claps because tidiness is a fine thing to promise. Another politician quotes liberty and collects a different clack. A newspaper prints outrage in the morning and an interview with a sex therapist in the afternoon, then sells both editions at a profit. Joke 2 counts the headlines. If consistency sold copies, newsstands would be monasteries. You enter a theatre where a new play dresses Victorian anxieties in modern shoes. The lines sparkle. The audience laughs at corsets and then goes home to scroll between earnest lectures and playful videos without leaving the couch. The tension between appetite and rule never vanishes. It learns new costumes. It makes playlists. A writer sips water backstage and hopes her work helps people imagine kindness with more detail, which might be the only useful kind of reform. Across the street, a clinic posts hours for free testing and quiet advice. The staff speak many languages, including the comforting one where shame retires early. A teenager asks practical questions without choking on them. A couple negotiate timing with gentle hands instead of chalk marks on a calendar. The air feels like a future that once would have been dismissed as impossible and now looks like Tuesday. The clinic's donation box fills with small notes that say thank you in crooked handwriting. Every coin sounds like a bedtime finally uncomplicated by panic. In a law library, a student pages through cases about speech, images, and the mystery of harm. She learns that courts today measure danger with more rulers and fewer sermons, and that every generation rewrites the test to suit its own confidence. She also learns how quickly panic can retrain an entire country to forget lessons about overreach. Historians still argue whether liberalization mostly followed prosperity, which gives people room for tolerance, or whether the courage of a few writers and campaigners changed the emotional weather for everyone else. Both stories contain truth if you hold them up to the light long enough. Gossip survives better than any statute. The internet perfects what alleyways began, and rumor moves faster than rumor ever dreamed. Old vices acquire new usernames. Old virtues acquire new filters. The lesson you carry from lamplit pavements to glowing screens fits in a sentence. Shame is a poor teacher. Consent, information, and equity do the job with fewer tears and better sleep. Joke 3 checks the street lamp. If wisdom were as viral as scandal, comment sections would sound like lullabies. You end where a river widens and the city exhales. The water remembers every dropped law, every crumpled pamphlet, every lost key. You stand with your hands in your pockets and watch a sky that has judged no one. The century behind you leaves footprints that have not washed away. Some are heavy, some are ridiculous in expensive shoes. Some look like a dance step learned in secret and finally performed in daylight. You breathe and the air tastes like coal in certain corners and like rain in others. Which is to say, it tastes like a place where people keep trying to live with their bodies and their neighbors without making either into an enemy. Ease your shoulders, let your jaw settle, and listen to the river fold itself into softer sounds, the kind you hear through a cracked window on a night when nothing urgent calls your name. You are standing in a gentle pocket of dark, warm enough to be kind, cool enough to be clear. The lamps along the bank glow like sleepy bees. A rowboat bumps appear with the patience of a heartbeat. Think of fabrics from the day, the rustle of skirts, the hush of coats, and picture them now as blankets tucked over every story. The loud parts fade, the tender parts remain. You breathe in and feel the city shrink to a single neighborhood, then to a single street, then to a single room where curtains move slightly with the tide of night air. Every complicated question from the day loosens thread by thread until it becomes a kind ribbon you do not have to hold. People in kitchens rinse cups. People in bedrooms place books face down and turn the lamp low. You are not required to solve anyone tonight. You are invited to rest. Let the river carry the last fragments of old arguments. They become small leaves that drift past and vanish under a bridge that knows how to forget. Your shoulders sink a little more. The ground under your shoes feels certain. A clock chimes from a tower, easy and far away, and you imagine the sound settling around rooftops like light snow that never melts, only quiets. Your breath finds a slower rhythm, and each exhale softens whatever stayed sharp. Picture a window with pale curtains and a narrow bed that fits you exactly. The sheet is cool and friendly. The pillow knows your shape. Outside, a faint fan hums, steady as a lullaby. You draw the blanket to your chin, and the room becomes a small boat, rocking so gently you barely notice the motion. Even memories behave themselves. They line up behind you and keep watch while you drift forward. Nothing chases you here. The night is on your side. Tomorrow will bring its errands and its jokes, but not yet. For now, the city holds you the way water holds a reflection. Lightly, completely, with no demands. Close your eyes, count nothing. Let the last lamp in your thoughts click off. One simple touch, and feel the dark become a calm sea. Good night, sweet dreams.